It was my grandson's birthday, a day meant for celebration, but when my son asked me, "Dad, why aren't you living in the house I built for you?" everything shifted. The room grew quiet, and I felt the weight of his question. I had not expected him to bring it up, especially in front of everyone. As the silence lingered, I realized the truth was about to come out, a truth I had been avoiding. His question would change everything. My name is Edison Wright. I am 69 years old, and until that afternoon, I thought I had done everything right by my family. As a retired construction contractor, I spent 40 years breaking my back so my son would never have to. But before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever sacrificed everything for a child, only to be treated like a burden. The afternoon sun beat down on the sprawling backyard of the $2 million estate my son Devin shared with his wife Harper. It was my grandson Mason's 7th birthday party, but looking around you would think it was a networking event for the city's wealthiest elite. Caterers in crisp white shirts floated past carrying trays of expensive appetizers. Harper's parents, Gary and Brenda, held court by the infinity pool, holding glasses of imported champagne and laughing loudly with their country club friends. I stood near the edge of the patio trying to make myself as small as possible. I was wearing my best Sunday suit, but next to the designer clothes and luxury watches surrounding me, my faded jacket and scuffed dress shoes made me look like I had wandered in off the street. I did not belong in this world of manicured lawns and superficial smiles. I was a man who built things with his hands, a man who knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. Yet I stayed in the corner holding a plastic cup of water, just happy to catch glimpses of little Mason running around in his superhero cape. I kept quiet, hoping to blend into the background. But in a family where appearances are everything, an old black man in a worn-out suit is a stain on a perfect picture. And my son was about to make sure everyone knew it. The music had quieted down for the cake cutting. Everyone gathered around the massive marble patio table. I stepped forward, just wanting to be near my grandson to sing to him. As the final notes of the song faded and everyone clapped, Devin turned to me. His eyes were cold and calculating. He held up his hand, demanding the attention of his wealthy guests. "Dad," he said, his voice projecting loud enough for the entire yard to hear. "I have been meaning to ask you something in front of everyone. Why aren't you living in the guest house I built for you? Why do you insist on staying down in that dark, unfinished basement?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. Harper's friends whispered behind their hands. Gary and Brenda exchanged a look of pure condescension. Devin's question was a masterclass in manipulation. To the outside world, he sounded like a concerned, generous son trying to provide for his stubborn, aging father. But I knew the truth. Devin had not built me a house. 5 years ago, when Devin wanted to start his own tech firm, he came to me begging for help. He was drowning in loans and the banks had turned him away. So I did what any loving father would do. I sold the home I had lived in for 40 years, the home where I raised him, and gave him $500,000 in cash. Every penny I had, officially to my name, went into his business. In return, he promised me the beautiful guest house on his new property. But the day I moved in, Harper decided the guest house would be better suited as her private yoga studio. I was quietly ushered down to the damp, windowless basement. Now, standing in front of the crowd, I felt a lump form in my throat. I could have exposed him right there. I could have told his rich friends that his entire empire was built on his father's sweat and blood. But I looked at little Mason, who was staring at me with innocent eyes. I swallowed my pride. "I am just set in my old ways, son," I said, forcing a gentle smile. "The basement is cozy enough for an old man like me." Devin smiled a triumphant, arrogant smirk. "Well, we try, folks," he announced to the laughing crowd. "But you know how the older generation gets." The party ended and the guests eventually drove away in their luxury cars. I retreated to my basement, pulling the thin blanket over my shoulders. The air down there was always cold, smelling of mildew and old concrete. I was sitting on the edge of my cot, staring at the blank wall, when the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs swung open. Heavy footsteps marched down the wooden steps. It was Harper. She was still wearing her expensive designer dress, but the fake, sweet smile she wore for her friends was completely gone. Her face was twisted into a snarl of pure disgust. "What were you thinking today, Edison?" she hissed, crossing her arms over her chest. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet basement. "You hovered around the cake looking like a homeless beggar. You almost embarrassed Devin in front of his investors." I stood up slowly, my joints aching from the damp cold. "I just wanted to wish my grandson a happy birthday, Harper," I said. "It is my right as his grandfather." "You're right," she mocked, stepping closer. Her pale face was flushed with anger. "You do not have rights in this house, Edison. You are a guest here. A charity case. Devin is too kind to say it, but you are a burden. We let you stay in this basement out of the goodness of our hearts, and you repay us by creeping around our high-profile guests, making us look like we dragged you out of a shelter." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Let me make this crystal clear. If you ever step out of line again or try to play the victim in front of my parents or our friends, I will make sure you never see Mason again. Do you understand me? You will be completely cut out of his life. You will rot down here alone." I kept my mouth shut. 40 years in the construction business had taught me how to handle toxic people. You never argue with a wrecking ball, you just step out of the way and let it swing. I nodded slowly, keeping my face entirely blank. "I understand, Harper," I said quietly. She scoffed, rolling her eyes in absolute contempt. "You better," she snapped, turning around abruptly to march back up the stairs. As she spun around, the sudden movement caused something to slip out of the shallow pocket of her designer dress. A small, crumpled piece of paper fluttered to the concrete floor, landing silently near my worn-out shoes. Harper did not notice. She stomped up the wooden stairs, slamming the heavy door shut behind her and locking it from the outside. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the damp basement, a daily reminder of my imprisonment. I let out a long, slow breath and bent down to pick up the paper she had dropped. My hands were rough and calloused from decades of hard labor, but they trembled slightly as I smoothed out the crumpled receipt. I put on my reading glasses and squinted at the faded ink under the single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was not a grocery receipt or a boutique bill. It was a formal past-due debt notice from a high-stakes casino downtown. The total amount owed was staggering, a number that made my stomach drop. But what truly froze the blood in my veins was the name printed clearly at the top of the final notice: Devin Wright. I stared at the thick black letters spelling my son's name. The amount due was a staggering $250,000. My chest tightened until it was hard to breathe. Devin was not a successful tech entrepreneur. He was a degenerate gambler. I sat down heavily on my stiff cot, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into my shirt pocket. My mind raced back to all those times Devin had claimed his company was just waiting on a huge round of funding to pay me back. It was all a lie to cover his addiction. I needed to know exactly how deep this hole went. I reached under my mattress and pulled out a prepaid cell phone. It was a device I kept strictly for my private real estate investments, entirely separate from the smartphone Harper monitored on the family plan. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to Marcus, an old friend from my construction days who now ran security for several exclusive downtown venues. When Marcus answered, I asked him to run a quiet check on Devin at the high-stakes tables. It took less than an hour for Marcus to call back. The reality was much worse than the piece of paper. Marcus told me Devin was a regular in the VIP lounges, known for losing massive hands and borrowing heavily from predatory lenders just to stay at the table. The casino was preparing to take severe legal action. I hung up the phone and looked around my damp concrete cell. I had given my son my life savings to build an empire, and he had thrown it away on blackjack and roulette. But a bigger question remained in my mind. If Devin was completely broke, how were he and Harper maintaining this $2 million lifestyle with luxury cars and catered parties? The answer to that question walked right through the front door the very next morning. I had gone upstairs to the kitchen to make my morning coffee when I saw a massive moving truck parked in the circular driveway. Gary and Brenda Harper's parents were standing in the grand foyer directing men carrying heavy leather luggage and antique furniture. I froze in my tracks, holding my coffee mug. Gary, who had filed for bankruptcy 3 years ago after his chain of car dealerships went under, was wearing a tailored Italian suit and a shiny gold watch. Brenda was draped in expensive cashmere, pointing a manicured finger toward the beautiful, detached guest house across the lawn, the very same guest house Devin had promised to me when he took my money. "Well, do not just stand there, Edison," Gary barked, snapping his fingers in my direction. He did not say good morning. He did not say hello. "Be a good man and grab those 2 heavy suitcases by the door. The movers charge by the hour, and you look like you could use the exercise. You people are always naturally built for heavy physical labor anyway." The casual racism in his tone was thinly veiled, a nasty habit he never bothered to hide when Devin was not in the room. I felt a surge of hot anger rise in my throat. I could have bought Gary and his entire bankrupt family 10 times over with the assets I had hidden away over the years. I could have crushed his fragile ego right then and there, but a smart builder never tears down a load-bearing wall until he knows what is holding up the roof. I needed to know exactly what these parasites were doing in my son's home. So I swallowed my pride. I put down my coffee mug, pasted a humble smile on my face, and nodded. "Yes, sir, Gary," I said, keeping my voice low and subservient. "Let me get those for you right away." As I carried their heavy bags across the manicured lawn toward the guest house, Brenda walked ahead of me, complaining loudly about the humidity and demanding that I make sure the air conditioning in their new permanent residence was set to exactly 68 degrees. They were moving in for good living like absolute royalty while I was rotting in the basement. For the next 3 days, I played the role of the obedient, silent servant perfectly. Gary and Brenda treated the guest house like a luxury hotel, and they treated me like their personal maid. They left half-eaten plates of expensive food on the coffee tables, threw their dirty clothes on the bathroom floor, and demanded I take out their trash every morning. Harper completely ignored this abuse, acting as if having her father-in-law serve her parents was the most natural thing in the world. Devin was barely home, leaving early and returning late, always looking frantic and exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. I endured every insult, every snap of their fingers, and every degrading chore because it gave me unrestricted access to their private space. Thursday morning, Brenda dragged Harper out for a full day of luxury spa treatments and shopping. Gary had gone to the golf course, leaving the guest house completely empty. I walked in, carrying my cleaning supplies, locking the door quietly behind me. The place was a disaster area, but my focus was not on the trash or the dirty dishes. My focus was on Gary's heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the living room. Gary was an arrogant man who believed he was untouchable, and arrogant men are always careless. He had left his leather briefcase sitting right on top of the desk unlocked. I put on a pair of latex cleaning gloves and opened the brass latch. I began pulling out stacks of financial documents, laying them flat on the desk and photographing every single page with my prepaid phone. There were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and investment portfolios. As I read through the numbers, the sickening truth of their arrangement became crystal clear. Gary and Brenda were not just living here for free. They were actively siphoning money from Devin's accounts. There were monthly transfers of $10,000 going directly from Devin's business account into Gary's offshore fund, labeled as consulting fees. Devin was bleeding money to the casino and being bled dry by his wife's greedy parents at the same time. But it was the thick folder at the very bottom of the briefcase that made my heart completely stop. The tab was labeled estate financing. I opened it and pulled out a stack of legal documents with the logo of a major national bank stamped on the top. It was a home equity line of credit, a massive loan taken out against the $2 million estate. Devin and Harper had mortgaged the entire property to the absolute limit to pay off the casino thugs and fund Gary's lavish lifestyle. I scanned the terms, reading the severe penalties for non-payment. The account was severely past due, and the bank was preparing to initiate foreclosure proceedings. But Devin did not own the house outright. Because he had terrible credit when he bought it, the bank required a financial guarantor with flawless credit and substantial assets to secure a loan of this magnitude. I flipped to the final signature page of the contract to see who the guarantor was. My breath caught in my throat. There on the dotted line was my full legal name, Edison Wright. It was signed in blue ink, perfectly mimicking the loops and curves of my handwriting. But I had never seen this document in my life. My own son and his wife had forged my signature. I snapped crystal clear photos of every single page of that forged home equity line of credit contract. I made sure to capture the notary stamp, the bank officer's signature, and the exact date my son and daughter-in-law committed federal fraud. I put the papers back exactly as I found them, closed Gary's briefcase, and walked out of the guest house with my cleaning supplies. My heart was pounding, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I went back to the basement, changed out of my work clothes, and left the property through the side gate. I took a cab straight to the downtown financial district, to an office building far above the pay grade of my son's failing tech startup. I sat in the plush leather chair across from Mr. Kaplan, my personal attorney for over 20 years. He was a ruthless corporate lawyer who handled my most sensitive contracts. I slid my prepaid phone across the mahogany desk, showing him the photos. Mr. Kaplan adjusted his glasses and examined the screen. His expression grew darker with every swipe. "Edison, "This is not just a petty family dispute," he said, his voice deadly serious. "This is massive financial fraud. Your son and his wife have leveraged your identity to secure a multi-million-dollar credit line. The bank is preparing to foreclose on the estate within the coming weeks. We can take this to the authorities right now and have them both arrested by tonight." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city skyline. "No," I replied softly but firmly. "Not yet. If we arrest them now, they will play the victims and claim desperation. I want them to feel invincible. I want them to dig a hole so deep they can never climb out." Mr. Kaplan nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. He was one of the very few people in this city who knew the absolute truth about my financial reality. To Devin and Harper, I was just a retired contractor who had drained his life savings to hand them $500,000. But they had no idea what I had been doing for the past 40 years while working on construction sites across the state. Whenever I saw a distressed property or a vacant lot in a developing zone, I bought it quietly. I held on to that land while the city expanded around it. Today, those neglected parcels were prime commercial real estate worth tens of millions of dollars. I was not a poor man living in a basement out of necessity. I was a silent tycoon who had chosen to live a modest life, hoping to teach my son the value of hard work and humility. Clearly, that lesson had failed entirely. I instructed Mr. Kaplan to keep monitoring the foreclosure proceedings and to trace every single transaction connected to Gary's offshore accounts. Then I left his office and made a stop at a specialized electronics store. I purchased several state-of-the-art micro cameras, the kind used by private investigators. They were wireless motion activated and small enough to be completely invisible. When I returned to the estate, the house was relatively quiet. Gary and Brenda were still out spending my stolen money, and Harper was busy upstairs. I worked quickly and efficiently using the skills I had honed over decades in construction. I installed the first camera inside a ventilation grate in the main living room, giving me a perfect view of the grand foyer and the staircase. I placed a second camera inside the guest house, perfectly angled toward Gary's heavy mahogany desk. Finally, I installed a third camera in my own damp basement, hidden inside the casing of the single bare light bulb. I linked all the feeds to a secure cloud server on my prepaid phone. I wanted to see every sneer, hear every insult, and record every illegal conversation taking place under this roof. I was no longer a helpless victim. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was laying the foundation perfectly. The sun was beginning to set when I walked out to the backyard to check the perimeter. That was when my heart skipped a beat. Scattered across the manicured grass right next to the infinity pool were my belongings. My old canvas duffel bag, my heavy winter coat, the few framed photographs of my late wife, and my modest collection of books were piled up like common garbage. The wooden frames were cracked, the glass shattered on the patio stones. I stood there staring at the remnants of my life casually tossed aside. Before I could even process the utter disrespect, the sliding glass door slammed open. Harper marched out onto the patio, holding a clipboard and glaring at me with absolute venom. Her parents, Gary and Brenda, stood right behind her, sipping expensive wine and watching the show with amused smiles. Devin was nowhere in sight, cowardly, avoiding the confrontation as usual. "What is the meaning of this, Harper?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady despite the rage boiling in my blood. She marched down the patio steps, stopping just a few feet away from me. "The meaning is that your free ride is over, Edison," she snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "My parents are permanently settled in the guest house, and we have decided to rent out the basement to a local college student to generate some extra passive income. We are running a household, not a charity." I looked at my broken picture frames on the ground and then back at her. "And where exactly am I supposed to go?" I asked softly. Harper smiled, a cold, calculated smirk that sent chills down my spine. She shoved a glossy brochure into my chest, forcing me to take it. "We have found a highly recommended state-funded assisted living facility just outside the city limits," she said brightly. "It is perfectly suited for someone in your rapidly declining mental state. You have been acting very confused lately, Edison, wandering around, forgetting your place, muttering to yourself. The doctor agrees that you need round-the-clock supervision." The audacity of her lie was staggering. She was setting the stage to declare me mentally incompetent through intense gaslighting. A state-funded facility was essentially a warehouse for the forgotten elderly, a place where people went to fade away in misery. She wanted me locked up and heavily medicated so I could never interfere with her and Devin's massive financial fraud. Gary chuckled from the patio, taking a sip of his wine. "It is for your own good, old man," he called out lazily. You will be much more comfortable with your own kind anyway." Harper crossed her arms, waiting for me to explode. She wanted me to yell to cause a scene so she could call the police and prove my supposed mental instability. She needed me to look dangerous and unhinged to validate her lies. I looked at the brochure in my calloused hands. The facility looked bleak and depressing, the exact kind of nightmare they thought I deserved. I looked back at Harper, seeing the pure greed and malice shining in her eyes. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. Instead, I let my shoulders slump, adopting the posture of a defeated, broken old man. I gave her a weak, trembling nod and smiled a sad, submissive smile. "You are right, Harper," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I have been feeling very tired lately. If you and Devin think this is what is best for me, I will pack the rest of my things." I stepped back away from my ruined belongings and walked slowly toward the basement door. I did not look back, but I could feel their triumphant grins burning into my back. They thought they had won. They thought they had buried me alive. But as I closed the heavy wooden door behind me, my sad smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, absolute certainty. The bait was set. The trap was armed. And they were walking right into it. The very next morning, the psychological warfare began in earnest. Harper did not waste a single minute setting the stage for my institutionalization. While I was in the kitchen pouring my morning coffee, she invited 3 of her wealthy neighborhood friends over for brunch on the patio. I listened through the cracked window as she poured mimosas and painted a tragic picture of my supposed mental decline. She sighed dramatically, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk napkin, telling them how I wander the halls at night muttering to myself. She claimed I had forgotten my own grandson's name twice this week. Her friends gasped in exaggerated sympathy, praising her for being such a saint to put up with a senile old man. It was a masterful performance designed to plant seeds of doubt in the community. But she did not stop at malicious gossip. Later that afternoon, I went to the bathroom cabinet to take my daily heart vitamins. The orange prescription bottle was completely gone. I checked the sink, the shelves, and even the trash can. Nothing. When I walked into the hallway, I found Harper standing there with a look of feigned pity. "Are you looking for these, Edison?" she asked, holding up the exact bottle I was searching for. "You left them in the refrigerator right next to the milk. I am getting really worried about you. You are becoming a danger to yourself." The gaslighting was so blatant, it was almost insulting. I had not opened the refrigerator all day. She was actively trying to make me doubt my own sanity, to break my mind so my bank accounts would be left undefended. I just stared at her, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. I took the bottle from her hands without a word and walked away, knowing my hidden cameras had captured her taking the pills from my cabinet 20 minutes earlier. That evening, Devin finally came home from the office looking more exhausted and defeated than ever. The heavy bags under his eyes were a clear sign that the casino debts and his failing tech company were crushing him. I found him alone in the grand foyer, taking off his expensive Italian leather shoes. This was my last attempt to save the boy I had raised. I needed to see if there was a shred of humanity left in my son before I brought the hammer down. "Devin, we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady and reasonable. "Your wife is telling the neighbors I am losing my mind. She is hiding my medication and trying to force me into a state-funded facility. I know about the casino debts, Devin. I know about the massive home equity line of credit you both took out." Devin froze. His shoulders stiffened and the color completely drained from his face. For a split second, I saw the terrified little boy who used to break a window and beg me not to tell his mother. But that boy was long gone. Instead of breaking down or asking for my forgiveness, Devin stood up straight and put on a mask of cold arrogance. "I do not know what you are talking about, Dad," he sneered, adjusting his designer tie. "Casino debts. You are hallucinating. This is exactly why Harper is looking into that facility for you. You are making up wild stories and becoming completely unmanageable." The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest. He was doubling down on his wife's malicious lies to protect his own skin. I stepped closer, looking directly into his eyes, hoping to find a flicker of guilt. "You are mortgaging everything, including my name, to pay for your gambling and your in-laws' lavish lifestyle," I said softly. "You are destroying your own family, Devin. Please stop this before it is too late. Just tell me the truth." But Devin simply scoffed and looked away. "Harper is right," he muttered, shaking his head in mock disappointment. You are completely losing your grip on reality. You need professional help, Dad, and we are going to make sure you get it. Do not fight us on this. It will only make things worse for you." He turned his back on me and walked up the grand staircase, leaving me standing alone in the foyer. He had made his choice. He chose the lies, the greed, and the cowardice. He had chosen his own destruction. The final escalation happened the very next afternoon. Gary and Brenda had gone to the country club and Devin was at his supposedly booming tech firm. I was in the living room packing a few of my remaining belongings into a cardboard box, playing the role of the defeated old man preparing for the nursing home. The house was dead quiet until the sharp clicking of Harper's heels echoed across the marble floor. She marched into the living room, her face flushed with a terrifying kind of excitement. She knew the end game was near and she wanted to deliver the finishing blow. "You are packing entirely too slow, Edison," she snapped, glaring down at me. "The transport van from the facility is coming tomorrow morning. I want you and your garbage out of my house before my parents return." I continued folding a shirt, refusing to engage with her venom. My silence only infuriated her more. She needed a reaction. She needed a violent outburst to justify the legal guardianship papers she and Devin were undoubtedly preparing. When I did not respond, Harper did something that chilled me to my core. She looked around the empty living room, ensuring there were no witnesses. Then, with a look of absolute madness in her eyes, she grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the coffee table. Before I could even process what was happening, she swung the heavy metal object and smashed it brutally against her own left forearm. She gasped in pain, dropping the candlestick to the floor with a loud clatter. A dark, ugly purple bruise began to form immediately on her pale skin. I stood up in shock, backing away from her. Harper let out a blood-curdling scream that tore through the quiet house. "Help! Somebody help me! He is attacking me!" She backed herself into the corner, clutching her bruised arm and sobbing hysterically. "Get away from me, Edison! Please stop! Do not hurt me!" Her performance was terrifyingly realistic. She was screaming loud enough for the neighbors across the street to hear. She grabbed her smartphone from the sofa and dialed 911, sobbing into the receiver. "Please send the police immediately. My father-in-law has gone completely crazy. He just attacked me with a metal candlestick and threatened my son. Please hurry, he is dangerous." She hung up the phone and looked at me through her fake tears. A wicked, triumphant smile spread across her face. "You are done, old man," she whispered maliciously. "You are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life locked in a padded room." Less than 10 minutes later, the wailing sirens of 2 police cruisers shattered the quiet suburban neighborhood. Heavy boots pounded against the front porch and officers burst through the front door with their hands resting on their holsters. Harper immediately collapsed into the arms of a female officer, sobbing uncontrollably and pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "He hit me!" she cried, pointing to the ugly purple bruise on her arm. "He tried to hurt me." An officer grabbed me roughly by the shoulder, spinning me around and pressing my chest against the wall. I did not resist. I let them pull my arms behind my back and lock the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around my wrists. Just as they were marching me toward the front door, Devin's luxury car screeched into the driveway. He ran inside, stopping dead in his tracks as he saw the police, the weapon on the floor, and his wife crying hysterically. Devin looked at me in handcuffs. I stared right back at him, waiting for my son to defend me, waiting for him to tell the truth. Instead, Devin looked away. He wrapped his arms around Harper, comforting her while standing completely motionless and apathetic as the officers dragged his innocent father out of the house like a common criminal. The cold metal of the holding cell bench bit into my back. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the cracked concrete walls of the downtown precinct. 2 detectives sat across from me, separated by a scratched steel table that smelled of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant. They were playing the classic interrogation routine, treating me like a senile, fragile old man who had finally snapped under the pressure of aging. The younger detective leaned forward, holding a notepad, speaking in a slow, condescending tone as if I were a toddler. He asked me repeatedly why I had attacked my daughter-in-law and if I was confused about where I was or what day it was. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single reaction. I did not yell about my innocence. I did not beg for mercy or demand a phone call to my family. I simply sat there with my hands resting calmly on my lap, staring straight ahead into the blank wall behind them. My utter silence was terrifying to them. Usually people in my situation panic cry or furiously deny the false accusations leveled against them, But my absolute stillness unnerved the experienced officers. They exchanged frustrated glances, completely unsure of how to handle a suspect who refused to play along with their predictable script. They thought they were breaking me down, but I knew exactly what I was doing. Every second I spent behind these heavy steel bars was another nail in the coffin Devin and Harper were eagerly building for themselves. They thought they had successfully removed the last obstacle to their fraudulent empire. They thought they had won the war. I let the detectives talk, letting the heavy silence stretch on for nearly 2 agonizing hours, until the thick steel door of the interrogation room finally clicked open. A man in an immaculate $3,000 charcoal suit strode into the cramped room carrying a sleek leather briefcase. It was Mr. Kaplan, my personal attorney. His sudden presence instantly shifted the power dynamic in the sterile interrogation room. He did not look at the detectives immediately. Instead, he walked directly over to me, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, and gave a firm nod. Then he turned his sharp, calculating gaze to the officers. "Gentlemen," Mr. Kaplan said, his voice dripping with icy authority, "you are currently holding my client illegally on the basis of a completely fabricated police report filed by a deeply disturbed woman. I suggest you remove those steel cuffs immediately before I file a civil rights lawsuit that will permanently drain this department's pension fund." The older detective scoffed, crossing his arms defensively, stating they had a victim with a severe contusion and a heavy brass weapon found at the scene, so his client was not going anywhere anytime soon. Mr. Kaplan did not waste his breath arguing. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a high-definition tablet, setting it flat on the scratched steel table. He pressed play without another word. The hidden camera footage from my living room filled the bright screen in pristine clarity. The detectives watched in stunned, breathless silence as the digital video showed Harper checking the empty room, grabbing the heavy brass candlestick and brutally smashing it against her own arm. The crisp audio captured her calculated screams and her fake sobbing as she dialed 911. The entire malicious performance was laid completely bare. The younger detective rubbed his face, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. Mr. Kaplan tapped the screen, pausing the video on Harper's triumphant, malicious smile just before the police sirens arrived. "As you can clearly see, gentlemen, my client is the victim of a coordinated conspiracy to commit elder abuse and file a false police report." The officers did not waste another second. The older detective immediately stepped forward and unlocked the handcuffs, freeing my bruised wrists. He muttered a sincere apology, looking deeply embarrassed by the colossal mistake his entire department had just made. They assured Mr. Kaplan that the assault charges against me were instantly dropped and that a felony warrant for Harper's arrest for filing a false report was being drawn up as we spoke. Mr. Kaplan closed his briefcase and looked at me, asking if he should have them dispatch a cruiser to arrest her right now. I rubbed my wrists, feeling the blood flow back into my stiff hands. "No," I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the small room. "Cancel the immediate warrant. Let her sleep comfortably in her stolen bed tonight, because I want to destroy them entirely on my own terms." Walking out of the precinct, I breathed in the cool, crisp night air. The heavy metal doors shut loudly behind me, marking the definitive end of my life as a helpless victim. I was no longer the poor, retired contractor wasting away in a damp, moldy basement. It was time to shed the pathetic disguise completely. Mr. Kaplan had a black luxury town car waiting silently by the curb. He opened the heavy door for me and we drove away from the gritty downtown station toward the most exclusive financial sector of the bustling city. I was absolutely not going back to the estate. Devin and Harper would assume I was sitting in a county jail cell awaiting a mandated psychiatric evaluation. Let them celebrate their temporary hollow victory. We arrived at a soaring glass skyscraper that overlooked the entire glittering skyline. The private security elevator whisked us up to the top floor opening directly into a massive 5,000-square-foot luxury penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city lights below. The pristine marble floors, the expensive modern art, and the custom Italian furniture were a far cry from the mildewed cot I had been sleeping on for months. This was one of the many luxury commercial properties I owned, quietly managed by my holding companies. I walked over to the sprawling mahogany desk in the center of the enormous room where Mr. Kaplan had already set up a secure encrypted laptop and a thick stack of financial dossiers. I poured myself a small glass of aged bourbon, savoring the rich, complex taste as I looked down at the city I had helped build. For 40 years I had built this metropolis from the ground up, pouring concrete and laying heavy steel. Now I was going to use my immense resources to carefully dismantle the fraudulent life my ungrateful son had built. I sat down at the heavy desk and opened the first confidential folder. It contained every single bank statement, wire transfer, and outstanding loan tied to Devon's failing tech company. He had been drowning in debt for years, hiding his severe incompetence behind a thin facade of fake success. He genuinely believed he was a brilliant entrepreneur who had simply hit a temporary rough patch. He had absolutely no idea that the only thing keeping his company afloat, keeping him from total bankruptcy, was a silent guardian angel. I turned to Mr. Kaplan, who was waiting patiently for my final instructions. Devon thinks he is waiting on a massive influx of capital from his primary venture capitalists tomorrow morning, I said, staring coldly at the digital spreadsheets. He thinks that money is going to cover his massive casino debts and somehow stop the impending foreclosure on the house. Mr. Kaplan nodded firmly, confirming that the anonymous trust was scheduled to release a $2 million lifeline to his corporate account at exactly 8 in the morning. He reminded me that I had been funding his illusion of success for 3 long years. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, letting the harsh reality of my next decision settle in my chest. It was time to pull the plug forever. Contact the bank directors. I instructed, my voice devoid of any paternal warmth. I want the anonymous trust dissolved immediately. Cancel the transfer completely, cut off every single line of credit, and freeze the backup corporate accounts. Do not leave him a single dime to survive on. Mr. Kaplan smiled a sharp, predatory smile and opened his laptop to execute the devastating orders. Tomorrow morning, my arrogant son was going to wake up and realize that the invisible safety net he had taken for granted his entire life was completely gone. The freefall was about to begin. The bright morning sun felt like a harsh spotlight exposing a massive fraud as Devon stormed into the grand lobby of his corporate bank. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning, and he had barely slept a single wink, expecting to wake up to a massive notification on his smartphone confirming a $2 million wire transfer. That money was supposed to be his ultimate salvation. It was earmarked to pay his furious development team, silence the aggressive casino debt collectors, and temporarily stall the looming foreclosure on the $2 million estate. Instead, his banking app showed a terrifying string of zeros. Devon marched directly past the regular teller line and barged into the glass-enclosed office of the branch manager, demanding immediate answers. He slammed his palms flat on the polished mahogany desk, his expensive Italian suit suddenly feeling tight and suffocating. He ordered the manager to manually refresh the system, shouting that a massive scheduled deposit from his primary venture capital firm was missing. The branch manager, a stern man who had tolerated Devon's arrogant outbursts for years, simply adjusted his glasses and turned his monitor around. The screen displayed a stark, glaring red banner across all of Devon's corporate accounts, indicating a total freeze. The manager folded his hands and spoke in a tone utterly devoid of sympathy. He informed Devon that not only was the expected wire transfer canceled, but the entire line of credit attached to his tech startup had been permanently revoked. Devon felt the blood drain from his face. He stammered loudly, insisting there had to be a catastrophic clerical error. He demanded they call the anonymous trust immediately and fix the glitch before his entire life fell apart. But the manager just shook his head, delivering the first crushing blow of reality. There was no glitch, and there was no money left to protect him. Devon paced frantically back and forth across the plush carpet of the manager's office, pulling at his designer tie as if it were a suffocating noose. He pulled out his phone and arrogantly ordered the manager to give him the direct contact information for the anonymous angel investor who had been funding his startup for the past 3 years. Devon loudly declared that he had a personal working relationship with the board of this trust and that they simply needed an updated quarterly projection report to release the funds. The branch manager let out a heavy sigh, removing his glasses and looking at Devon with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. The manager plainly stated that there was no board of directors and there was no venture capital firm. Devon froze, his manic pacing coming to an abrupt halt. He demanded to know what the manager meant. The harsh truth was finally laid bare in that cold office. The manager explained that the anonymous trust was a single private individual who had mandated absolute secrecy. For 3 long years, this single anonymous investor had been artificially keeping Devon's failing tech company alive. The manager pulled a thick physical file from his drawer and tossed it onto the desk, telling Devon to look closely at his own financial history. Devon opened the folder with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the detailed spreadsheets, and the reality of his profound incompetence hit him like a speeding freight train. His tech startup had never generated a single dollar of actual profit. Every payroll cycle, every expensive corporate retreat, every leased luxury company car had been paid for by this invisible benefactor. The angel investor had not been buying equity, they had been paying to sustain Devon's elaborate fantasy. And now that invisible safety net was completely gone. The manager delivered the final devastating update. At exactly 8 in the morning, the anonymous backer had executed a legally binding directive to permanently dissolve the trust and sever all financial ties with Devon's company. They had also legally alerted the casino creditors that the corporate accounts were no longer shielded. Devon stared at the papers, his vision blurring with hot tears of panic. His entire identity as a self-made tech genius was a pathetic fabrication. He was a complete fraud, and the invisible hand that had propped him up had just dropped him into a bottomless abyss. He stumbled backward out of the office, gasping for air as the crushing weight of total bankruptcy settled squarely on his shoulders. Devon stumbled out of the bank and practically fell into the driver's seat of his luxury sports car. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely press the push-to-start button. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the walls of his perfectly curated life closed in to crush him. He desperately needed someone to blame. He needed a scapegoat to absorb the shock of this massive failure. His twisted mind immediately went to the easiest target he had ever known: his father. Devon convinced himself that this catastrophic run of bad luck had started the exact moment Edison embarrassed him at the birthday party. In his frantic, desperate state, he decided he would drive to the county jail, scream at his father, and demand that the old man somehow take the fall for the fraudulent home equity loans before the bank seized the estate. He pulled out his smartphone and furiously dialed the familiar contact number he had used to ignore his father for years. He pressed the phone to his ear, expecting it to ring and connect him to the precinct. Instead, a cold, automated voice echoed through the car's Bluetooth speakers, informing him that the number he had dialed was disconnected and no longer in service. Devon aggressively tapped the screen and dialed again, cursing loudly and pounding his fist against the steering wheel, but the exact same automated message played back. He threw his expensive phone against the passenger seat in a fit of childish rage. He thought his father was sitting in a holding cell awaiting a psychiatric evaluation. How could his phone be disconnected permanently? Panic began to claw at Devon's throat like a wild animal. He realized he needed to formulate an emergency escape plan with his wife before the collectors found him. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding recklessly through the downtown traffic, running red lights and swerving aggressively between lanes. He was terrified that the aggressive loan sharks from the casino were already dispatching men to his office, or worse, to his home. The $2 million estate was the only tangible asset he had left, even if it was fraudulently mortgaged to the absolute limit. He pulled onto his quiet upscale street and practically launched his car into the circular driveway, stopping inches from the manicured lawn. The massive oak front doors were slightly ajar. Devon sprinted up the concrete steps, shouting Harper's name, his voice cracking with pure terror. He burst through the grand foyer, expecting Harper to be lounging in the living room or consulting with her terrible parents about their next vicious move against his father. The ground floor was completely empty and dead quiet. He bounded up the sweeping marble staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, and sprinted straight toward their master bedroom. Devon pushed the heavy solid wood door open and froze, completely paralyzed by the chaotic scene unfolding in front of him. Harper was not crying or worrying about the false police report she had filed the day before. She was frantically tearing apart their massive walk-in closet. Expensive designer clothes were thrown carelessly across the plush rugs. In the center of their king-sized bed lay a large, open leather duffel bag. Harper was breathing heavily, her hands moving with terrified speed as she dumped thick stacks of hidden emergency cash, heavy gold jewelry, and expensive watches into the dark bag. But what made Devon's heart completely shatter, what made the air leave his lungs entirely, was what lay resting on the nightstand right beside her packed bag. It was her blue passport and little Mason's passport resting neatly on top of a printed one-way flight itinerary. Devon's passport was nowhere to be seen. Harper froze, looking up at her husband with wide, panicked eyes, her hands still clutching a thick wad of stolen $100 bills. Devon stared at the open leather duffel bag and the 2 blue passports resting perfectly on the nightstand. The air in the luxurious master bedroom grew incredibly thick, stifling his ability to breathe. Harper dropped the stack of stolen $100 bills, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. Before Devin could scream, before he could demand to know where she thought she was going without him, the sharp, urgent chime of the front doorbell shattered the suffocating silence. Devin did not take his eyes off his wife. He slowly backed out of the room, his heart hammering furiously against his ribs, and sprinted back down the sweeping marble staircase. He ripped open the heavy front doors, fully expecting to see the aggressive casino debt collector standing on his porch, ready to break his legs. Instead, he found a single unmarked thick manila envelope resting perfectly centered on the expensive welcome mat. There was no courier in sight. The quiet, manicured suburban street was completely empty. Devin picked up the heavy envelope. It had his name typed in bold, black letters across the front. A sudden wave of nausea washed over him as his hands trembled. He tore the thick paper seal right there in the grand foyer, the very place where he had cowardly ignored his father's warnings just a day ago. He pulled out a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs and a small typed note. What he saw in those images made his vision blur and his stomach violently churn. The first photograph showed Harper sitting in a dimly lit, upscale downtown restaurant across from a man wearing a sharp, tailored suit. Devin recognized the man instantly. It was the senior loan officer from the National Bank, the exact same man who had personally processed and approved their massive multi-million-dollar home equity line of credit. The second photograph was taken outside a boutique hotel. The loan officer had his hands wrapped tightly around Harper's waist, pulling her in for a passionate kiss. The third and fourth pictures left absolutely nothing to the imagination, confirming that Harper's relationship with the bank official was not just a passing flirtation. It was an intense, ongoing affair. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Devin's mind with devastating and absolute clarity. Harper had not just forged his father's signature on the legal loan documents. She had actively seduced the bank official to ensure the fraudulent paperwork bypassed the standard security checks. She traded her marriage vows to secure the cash needed to fund her parents' luxurious lifestyle and her own secret escape fund. Devin let out a guttural scream of pure, agonizing rage. He charged back up the staircase, gripping the glossy photographs so tightly his knuckles turned white. He kicked the bedroom door wide open, throwing the pictures directly into Harper's face. They scattered across the expensive rugs and the bed, landing right next to her packed bags. Harper looked down at the images of her own infidelity and gasped, stepping back against the wall. "You are a monster!" Devin roared, his voice tearing through the quiet estate. "You used me. You forged my father's signature. You slept with the banker to get the loan approved, and now you are trying to steal my son and run away." Harper did not cry or apologize. Her initial shock quickly vanished, replaced by a look of cold, calculating disdain. She stepped over the photos and crossed her arms. "You were a pathetic, sinking ship, Devin," she spat back, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "Your company is a complete joke. You gamble away every single dollar we have. I did what I had to do to survive and protect my son from your massive failures. You are a complete loser, and I was not going to let you drag me down to the bottom with you." The sheer volume of their explosive argument echoed across the manicured lawns, reaching the detached guest house. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, and Gary burst into the master bedroom with Brenda right behind him. Gary did not ask what was wrong. He did not care about the scattered photos proving his daughter's severe betrayal. He immediately stepped between Devin and Harper, puffing out his chest and shoving Devin hard in the shoulder. "You back away from my daughter right now, you worthless piece of trash!" Gary bellowed, his face turning a blotchy, angry red. Devin stumbled back, pointing a shaking finger at the scattered evidence on the floor. "She is a liar and a cheat," Devin yelled. "She slept with the bank officer to commit federal fraud. She is stealing my money and trying to run away with my son." Brenda stepped forward, her face twisted into an ugly sneer. "What money, Devin?" she mocked, kicking one of the photos aside. "You do not have a single dime to your name. You are a broke, degenerate gambler. We always knew you were nothing but a fast-talking fraud playing dress-up in a rich neighborhood." Gary stepped closer, invading Devin's personal space, dropping the thin veil of tolerance he had worn for years. "We never wanted her to marry you anyway," Gary hissed, his voice laced with pure racial hatred. "You can put on expensive Italian suits and drive fancy sports cars, but underneath it all, you are just a street hustler from the wrong side of the tracks. You and your miserable father are exactly the same. You do not belong in this world. You never did. This house belongs to us now, and you are going to get out before I break your jaw." Devin felt the air completely leave his lungs. For years, he had alienated his own father, abandoning his roots to desperately fit into Harper's wealthy white world. He had bought their clothes, paid for their vacations, and funded their bankrupt lives. Now they were looking at him with absolute disgust, stripping away his dignity and attacking the very color of his skin. The ultimate betrayal was complete. He had sold his soul to people who secretly despised him. Devin clenched his fists, ready to swing at Gary's smug face. Before Devin could throw a punch, the piercing sound of police sirens wailed in the distance, rapidly approaching the estate. Harper had quietly dialed emergency services the moment Devin found the photos. Within minutes, armed officers stormed up the staircase just as they had done to his father the day before. Harper burst into fake theatrical tears, pointing a trembling finger at Devin. She sobbed to the officers, claiming her husband was having a violent gambling-induced breakdown and was threatening to kill her parents. Gary quickly corroborated the lie, demanding the officers remove the dangerous man from their property. Devin desperately tried to explain the fraud and the infidelity, pointing to the photos on the floor, but the officers refused to listen. They grabbed Devin roughly by the arms, twisting them behind his back. Without giving him a single chance to grab his wallet, his keys, or a change of clothes, they marched him forcefully down the stairs and shoved him out the front door. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, locking him out of the $2 million mansion he thought he owned. Devin stood alone on the cold suburban street with absolutely nothing left to his name. Devin stood shivering on the cold concrete sidewalk, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers fade into the dark distance. The heavy oak doors of the $2 million estate were locked tight, barricading him from the fraudulent life he had so desperately tried to protect. He dug his trembling hands into the pockets of his ruined Italian suit and felt a cold piece of metal. By sheer luck, he had grabbed the keys to an old rusted company utility truck earlier that morning and shoved them into his jacket. It was a vehicle he kept strictly for hauling server equipment, a truck he usually considered entirely beneath his dignity to drive. With no other options and the chill of the night biting through his thin dress shirt, he walked 3 grueling miles to the commercial overflow parking lot where the truck was kept. He climbed into the cabin, shivering violently as the cracked vinyl seats offered absolutely no warmth. His stomach churned with anxiety as he pulled out his smartphone with its shattered screen. He opened a hotel booking app, desperately trying to reserve a cheap motel room for the night. He typed in his primary corporate credit card number. A red error message flashed on the screen declaring the card was declined. Panic rising, he typed in his personal platinum card. Declined. He tried his joint account card, his emergency backup card, and even a digital payment service. Every single one was declined, locked, or completely frozen. He had absolutely zero access to his own money. The realization hit him with sickening force. He was completely destitute. He curled his tall frame awkwardly across the front seats of the utility truck, pulling his suit jacket tightly around his shoulders. For the first time in his privileged, arrogant life, Devin spent the night shivering in the cold, sleeping in a vehicle like a discarded stray. When the morning sun pierced through the dirty windshield, Devin woke up with a stiff neck and a hollow, agonizing ache in his stomach. He sat up slowly, catching his reflection in the rearview mirror. His designer suit was incredibly wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were bloodshot and sunken. He looked exactly like the broken, desperate people he and Harper used to mock from the windows of their luxury sports cars. He stepped out of the truck feeling the immediate sting of absolute rock bottom. Business professionals walked past him on the sidewalk, clutching their hot coffees and briefcases, actively avoiding eye contact with him. The looks of sheer disgust they gave him felt like physical blows. He was now invisible, just another destitute man on the street. Hunger gnawed relentlessly at his insides, but he did not have a single dollar bill to buy even a stale piece of bread. The crushing weight of his monumental failures finally shattered his ego. He thought about Harper betraying him with the bank officer. He thought about Gary and Brenda insulting the color of his skin while living off his stolen money. But most painfully, he thought about his father. He remembered standing frozen in the grand foyer, allowing the police to drag Edison away in handcuffs. The guilt was suffocating. He needed his father. He needed the one man who had always unconditionally bailed him out of his worst mistakes. Desperate to find him, Devin started the sputtering engine of the utility truck. He knew Edison would never go back to the estate, so he drove toward the industrial district to his father's old construction sites. It was a gritty, dusty part of town Devin had actively avoided for years, considering it a shameful reminder of his working-class roots. He pulled into a busy lumber yard and approached an older foreman asking if anyone had seen Edison Wright. The foreman gave Devon's ruined suit a highly suspicious look before crossing his arms. The foreman stated he had not seen Edison pushing a wheelbarrow in years, but he had seen him just an hour ago stepping into a sleek black private town car, heading toward the upscale financial district. Devon thanked the foreman and rushed back to his utility truck, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. He navigated the clunky, loud vehicle through the sleek, pristine streets of the downtown financial sector, feeling entirely out of place among the towering glass skyscrapers. He scanned the bustling avenues, desperately searching for the black town car the foreman had described. Just as he was about to give up and pull over, his eyes caught a familiar license plate pulling up to a gold-plated valet stand. Devon recognized the address immediately. It was the most exclusive reservations only Michelin star restaurant in the entire city. It was a place Devon had personally tried to book for months to impress a group of tech investors, only to be bluntly rejected by the hostess because he lacked the proper elite connections. He watched in stunned silence as a uniformed valet rushed forward to open the door of the luxury town car. Devon quickly pulled his rusted utility truck into a dark, narrow alleyway across the street, turning off the engine. He crept out of the vehicle, staying hidden in the shadows, and slowly walked toward the glowing floor-to-ceiling windows of the magnificent restaurant. He fully expected to see his father sitting in a dark corner wearing his faded work jacket, perhaps begging an old, wealthy client for a small loan or a low-level management job to survive after being kicked out of the basement. Devon pressed his back against the cold brick wall, wiping a smudge of grime off the immaculate glass to peer inside. The dining room was filled with the city's absolute highest society, dripping in diamonds and bespoke tailoring. He scanned the room and his eyes finally landed on the center table. Devon completely froze his breath, catching painfully in his throat. He could not believe what he was seeing. Sitting at the absolute best table in the entire restaurant, directly under a glowing crystal chandelier, was his father. But this was not the defeated, broken old man who had silently endured Harper's vicious insults in a damp basement. Edison was wearing an impeccably tailored dark suit that radiated pure authority. He held a glass of incredibly expensive vintage wine, laughing with an effortless, commanding confidence. Devon pressed his hands against the cold glass, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he recognized the men sitting around his father. There was the city's top real estate developer, a prominent state politician, and the chief executive of a major national bank. They were all leaning forward, hanging on to Edison's every single word, treating him with a level of deep reverence and absolute respect that Devon had never commanded in his entire life. Edison was not begging for a job. He was holding court. Devon watched his father exude a quiet, terrifying power, and the catastrophic truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. His father was never a poor, helpless man. He was the kingmaker. I took a sip of my vintage Cabernet, listening to the city mayor discuss the new downtown zoning laws. My phone buzzed silently in my tailored suit pocket, but I completely ignored it. The atmosphere in the exclusive dining room was calm and refined until a sudden loud crash shattered the quiet elegance. I turned my head toward the grand glass entrance. The heavy velvet ropes guarding the hostess stand were knocked entirely to the marble floor. The impeccably dressed maitre d' was shouting for security as a disheveled, frantic man pushed past him. It was Devon. My son looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive Italian suit was crumpled, stained with grease and dirt from sleeping in a rusted utility truck. His hair was a wild mess, and his eyes were wide with desperate, manic energy. The wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables gasped in shock, pulling their wives closer and signaling for the waiters to intervene. Two burly security guards in dark suits immediately lunged forward, grabbing Devon by the shoulders to drag him out of the Michelin star establishment. Devon thrashed wildly against their grip, kicking over a silver ice bucket and screaming my name at the top of his lungs. "Dad," he yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "Dad, please tell them who I am. I need to talk to you right now." The mayor raised an eyebrow, looking at me in sheer confusion. I placed my wine glass down deliberately, taking a slow, deep breath. I raised my right hand, signaling the security guards to halt. They immediately loosened their grip, waiting for my command. "Let him go." I said, my voice low and commanding, echoing through the stunned, silent restaurant. "He is my son." The entire room fell into a heavy, dead silence. The powerful men at my table, including a prominent state politician and the chief executive of a major national bank, stared at the broken man standing before us. Devon looked around the luxurious space, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of my true influence. The guards stepped back, keeping a highly watchful eye on him. Devin stumbled forward, practically falling onto the pristine white tablecloth. He looked at the powerful men sitting around me, his eyes darting frantically before locking onto my calm, unbothered expression. He did not ask how I was sitting there, or how I had transformed from a basement dweller into a man of immense power. His narcissism and sheer desperation completely blinded him to anything but his own immediate survival. "Dad, you have to help me," Devin pleaded, dropping to his knees right there on the expensive dining room rug. He grabbed the edge of the table, tears streaming down his dirty face. "Harper destroyed everything. She is a complete monster, Dad. She was sleeping with the bank executive behind my back for months. She and her racist parents set me up and threw me out on the street like a stray dog. They locked me out of the estate and froze all my accounts. I have absolutely nothing left." He was sobbing loudly, putting on a theatrical performance of victimhood, hoping to manipulate my paternal instincts just as he had done 100 times before. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, expecting me to immediately wrap my arms around him and write a blank check to fix his massive failures. "Please, Dad, you have to save my tech company," Devin cried, his voice echoing through the silent restaurant. "I know you have money now. I see you sitting here with these powerful men. You have to bail me out before the casino collectors kill me. Think about your grandson, Dad. Think about little Mason. Harper is trying to kidnap him and run away overseas. If you do not give me the money to hire the best lawyers, she will take Mason away forever, and we will never see him again. You are the only one who can fix this." He was using his own child as a bargaining chip, an emotional weapon to force my hand. It was the exact same manipulative tactic his wife had used for years. He took absolutely zero responsibility for gambling away my life savings, for constantly disrespecting me, or for standing by silently while the police dragged me out of my own home in handcuffs. He just wanted a quick, magical rescue without facing any real consequences. I looked down at my weeping son, feeling absolutely no pity in my heart. The immense love I once had for him had been systematically beaten out of me by his endless cruelty and bottomless greed. For 40 years, I broke my back laying bricks and pouring concrete so he would never have to struggle. I gave him $500,000 to build his dreams, and he repaid me by shoving me into a damp basement. I calmly reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a neatly folded piece of thick legal paper. It was the high-resolution printed photograph of the home equity line of credit contract, the exact document I had found hidden in his father-in-law's mahogany desk. I slowly unfolded the paper and tossed it directly into Devin's crying face. It fluttered through the air and landed right on his lap, displaying the forged signature in bright blue ink. Devin looked down at the document and his fake sobbing instantly stopped. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "Save you?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet but sharp enough to cut glass. "You want me to save the man who mortgaged my name and my credit to pay off his degenerate casino debts? You want me to rescue the man who forged my signature to secure a multi-million-dollar loan for his racist in-laws?" Devin stammered, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he picked up the paper. "Dad, I can explain," he whispered frantically, looking around at the wealthy men sitting at my table who were watching him with absolute disgust. I was desperate. Harper made me do it. She said it was the only way to keep the business afloat. I slammed my fist onto the table, causing the crystal wine glasses to rattle violently. "Do not blame your treacherous wife for your own profound cowardice," I ordered, my voice booming with unquestionable authority. "You stood perfectly still and watched armed police officers slap steel handcuffs on my wrists for a crime I did not commit. You watched them drag me out of that house, and you did not say a single word to defend me. You threw me out, stole my life savings, and tried to lock me in a state-funded asylum so you could steal whatever I had left." I leaned forward, staring directly into his terrified, wide eyes. "You are not a victim, Devin. You are a criminal. And I do not have a son who behaves like a criminal." Devin reached out a trembling hand, trying to grab my suit jacket, but the security guards immediately stepped forward and pinned his arms firmly to his sides. "Dad, please do not do this to me," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I will do anything. I will work for you. Just please do not leave me out here to die." I adjusted my suit jacket and picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I am not doing anything to you, Devin," I replied coldly. "I am simply letting you face the exact consequences you created for yourself." I turned my chair away from him, deliberately breaking eye contact, and resumed my conversation with the bank executive sitting to my left. The guards hauled Devin forcefully to his feet, dragging him backward toward the restaurant entrance. Just as they pushed him through the heavy glass doors, a stern man in a cheap brown suit stepped directly into Devin's path. The man pulled a thick stack of manila envelopes from his briefcase and shoved them hard against Devin's chest. "Devin Wright," the man announced loudly. "You have been officially served." The papers scattered across the pavement, revealing bright red court stamps for massive casino debt collection and severe federal fraud charges. I watched through the window as my son sank to the cold concrete, completely destroyed. While Devin was collapsing on the cold concrete sidewalk outside the restaurant, his wife was already setting the next phase of her malicious plan into motion. Inside the sprawling $2 million estate, Harper sat at the massive dining room table with a shark of a divorce attorney she had hired using the stolen cash from her emergency duffel bag. Gary and Brenda stood right behind her, beaming with absolute pride as they watched their daughter sign the thick stack of legal separation documents. They were completely convinced they had orchestrated the perfect crime. In their arrogant minds, the strategy was flawless. By filing for divorce, citing Devin's severe gambling addiction and financial instability, Harper believed she was legally entitled to sole ownership of the entire estate and full custody of little Mason. Furthermore, they mistakenly assumed that because my forged signature was on the home equity line of credit, I would be legally forced to pay off the massive bank debt while they got to keep the physical house. Gary poured 3 glasses of imported champagne, sliding one across the polished table to the sleazy attorney. He laughed loudly, declaring that getting rid of Devin and his crazy father was the best business move his daughter had ever made. Brenda chimed in, adjusting her expensive cashmere sweater, bragging that they could finally upgrade the interior decor now that the so-called street trash was permanently removed from their lives. They toasted to their brilliant deception, entirely unaware that they were celebrating inside a house made of cards that was rapidly catching fire. 2 nights later, Harper decided to throw a lavish liberation party right in the center of the grand living room to publicly celebrate her impending divorce and her new status as a wealthy single socialite. The estate was brightly lit with expensive caterers carrying trays of caviar and vintage wine to dozens of elite guests. Harper had invited her wealthy neighborhood friends, her parents' obnoxious country club buddies, and most brazenly, the senior bank executive she had been sleeping with. She clung tightly to the executive's arm, wearing a stunning designer dress, openly flaunting her affair as if it were a badge of honor. She paraded him around the room, introducing him as her new partner, completely devoid of any shame or guilt. Gary stood near the grand fireplace, holding a crystal glass of whiskey, loudly boasting to his friends about how he had personally thrown Devin out onto the street. He made thinly veiled racist jokes about how people from my background always end up exactly where they belong, in the gutter. He claimed the estate was now his permanent family compound, a well-deserved reward for dealing with such incompetent in-laws. The music pulsed loudly through the built-in surround sound speakers, mixing with the arrogant laughter of people who believed they were utterly untouchable. They were eating, drinking, and dancing on floors paid for entirely by my decades of hard labor. Harper stood in the center of the room, raising her glass for a toast, thanking everyone for supporting her through such a toxic marriage. She smiled maliciously, soaking in the applause and the fake sympathy of her wealthy friends. The atmosphere was thick with overwhelming entitlement and the sickening illusion of absolute victory. They truly believed they had conquered the world. Right in the middle of Harper's boastful toast, a sudden thunderous pounding on the solid oak front doors echoed through the grand foyer. The loud, aggressive knocking completely drowned out the music and the chatter. The guests froze, lowering their champagne glasses and exchanging confused glances. Harper rolled her eyes and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She turned to her bank executive lover and smirked, assuming it was just Devin crawling back to the house to beg on his knees for a second chance. Gary puffed out his chest, his face turning red with irritation at the interruption. He loudly announced to the silent crowd that he would personally handle throwing the garbage out one more time. He marched confidently toward the grand foyer, rolling up his expensive sleeves, ready to humiliate my son in front of all their high society friends. Harper and her lover followed closely behind, holding their drinks, expecting to enjoy a pathetic show of desperation. Gary reached the front doors and violently swung them wide open, a nasty insult already loaded on his tongue. But the arrogant smirk instantly vanished from his face, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. It was not Devin standing on the welcome mat. The massive, imposing figures waiting on the front porch made the blood entirely drain from Gary's cheeks. The heavy silence stretched into the grand living room, causing the wealthy guests to step back in fear. Standing on the porch was a heavily armed tactical police unit alongside the local chief of police, and stepping out from behind the wall of blue uniforms wearing an immaculate charcoal suit and a cold, predatory smile was my attorney, Mr. Kaplan. He held a thick stacks of official documents bearing the heavy red seal of the federal government. The caterers stopped moving. Harper dropped her expensive champagne glass, watching it shatter into pieces against the pristine marble floor. Mr. Kaplan stepped right over the threshold uninvited, his sharp eyes sweeping over the terrified faces of Harper, Gary, and Brenda. He raised the thick legal document, his voice echoing like thunder across the grand foyer and into the crowded party. He loudly announced that by the supreme authority of the federal court, they were executing an immediate seizure warrant for the entire premises and every single asset within it. The steel trap had officially snapped shut. I sat in my luxury penthouse miles away watching the entire scene unfold in high definition on my secure laptop. The hidden cameras I had installed in the living room and guest house captured every drop of sweat forming on Gary's forehead. Mr. Kaplan stood tall in the grand foyer, flanked by the police chief holding up the federal injunction. He projected his voice so every elite guest in the room could hear the absolute truth. "You do not own this property, Harper," Mr. Kaplan announced sharply, his words cutting through the shocked silence. "This entire estate, the land, the main house, and the guest house, belongs exclusively to an anonymous blind trust. My client, Edison Wright, is the sole executor and beneficiary of that trust. Devon was merely a tenant on paper allowed to reside here at my client's discretion." Harper scoffed, her face turning a blotchy red as she tried to maintain her haughty facade in front of her friends. "That is impossible," she snapped, crossing her arms. "We took out a multi-million-dollar home equity line of credit on this house. The bank fully approved it. We have the paperwork." Mr. Kaplan smiled a cold, predatory smile and pulled a copy of the forged contract from his briefcase. "You have fraudulent paperwork, Harper," he corrected her. "You and your husband forged Edison Wright's signature to mortgage a property you had absolutely no legal right to leverage. Because the underlying asset does not belong to you, the home equity line of credit is entirely null and void. You essentially stole millions of dollars from a federally insured institution using phantom collateral." The gasps from the wealthy guests echoed through my laptop speakers. Harper's arrogant smirk vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Gary aggressively pushed his way to the front, his face trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. He pointed a shaking finger at Mr. Kaplan, demanding the police remove him from the premises. He shouted that he was a respected businessman and would not be intimidated by cheap legal tricks. Mr. Kaplan did not even blink. He simply turned his sharp gaze directly onto Gary and handed him a separate stack of thick legal documents. "You are no longer a businessman, Gary," Mr. Kaplan stated, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "You are the primary beneficiary of massive federal wire fraud. We have meticulously tracked every single dollar from the fraudulent bank loan. We traced the illegal monthly consulting fees Devon wired directly into your hidden offshore accounts. We tracked the funds you used to purchase your expensive sports cars, your country club memberships, and the designer clothes currently sitting in that guest house." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching her pearl necklace as if she were about to faint. Gary ripped the papers from Mr. Kaplan's hands, scanning the pages with wide, terrified eyes. Mr. Kaplan continued delivering the killing blow with flawless precision. "Because the original collateral for the loan is legally invalid, the National Bank is now executing an immediate emergency recall of the stolen funds. To satisfy the massive outstanding debt, they have officially frozen all of your personal banking accounts. Furthermore, federal marshals are currently at your primary residence across the state, seizing your remaining properties, your vehicles, and your investment portfolios. You are completely bankrupt, Gary. You do not have a single dime left to your name." Gary stumbled backward, bumping into a caterer and knocking a tray of expensive caviar to the marble floor. Brenda began sobbing hysterically, screaming at her husband to do something to call their own lawyers. But there was absolutely nothing left to do. The ironclad legal trap I had spent weeks carefully constructing had snapped completely shut around their necks. The wealthy elite guests who had been drinking their expensive champagne just minutes ago began quietly backing away toward the exits, terrified of being associated with such a monumental financial scandal. Gary and Brenda, the arrogant racists who had treated me like a worthless servant, were now entirely destitute. stripped of their fake wealth and their fake dignity right in front of their high society friends. Harper watched her parents' entire world completely collapse in a matter of seconds. The reality of her catastrophic failure finally crashed down upon her. She looked frantically around the grand living room, her eyes darting through the crowd of fleeing guests, until she spotted the senior bank executive she had been parading around all night. He was slowly edging his way toward the front doors, desperately trying to escape unnoticed. Harper lunged forward, grabbing him tightly by the sleeve of his expensive tailored suit. "Do something," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "You are the senior loan officer. You approved the paperwork. You told me the background checks were completely cleared. Tell them the loan is perfectly legal. Fix this right now." She was publicly clinging to him, exposing their illicit affair and their joint criminal conspiracy to a room full of witnesses and police officers. The bank executive forcefully yanked his arm out of her frantic grip, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Are you completely insane?" he hissed, backing away from her as if she were a literal disease. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Harper. You submitted forged documents and lied to the underwriting department. You tricked me. I am a victim of your massive financial fraud." Harper let out a guttural shriek of pure betrayal. She lunged at him, clawing at his suit jacket, screaming that they had planned the entire scheme together in his hotel room. She shouted that he knew exactly what they were doing when they bypassed the signature verification process. The police chief stepped forward, instructing his officers to separate the hysterical woman from the terrified bank official. Harper fought against the uniformed officers, kicking and thrashing, demanding that someone listen to her. She screamed that she was a respectable woman from a good family and that she was being unfairly targeted by a vindictive old man. She begged her lover to use his immense influence at the National Bank to freeze the seizure orders and protect her parents' assets. She pleaded with him to call his board of directors and make the nightmare go away. But the bank executive just smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. He loudly declared to the police chief that he was fully prepared to cooperate with any federal investigation against Harper and her family to clear his own good name. He quickly turned his back on her and slipped out the massive front doors, leaving her screaming in the custody of the local police. As Harper continued to thrash against the police officers, the massive flat-screen television above the grand fireplace suddenly switched to a breaking local news broadcast. The bright red banner across the bottom of the screen read, "Live, Federal Bureau of Investigation executes massive financial fraud bust." The high-definition news helicopter was hovering directly over our exact suburban neighborhood. The camera zoomed in, capturing a live feed of the estate driveway. The guests in the living room gasped as they looked from the television screen to the grand foyer. On the live broadcast, the news anchor announced that the mastermind behind a massive federal loan fraud syndicate was currently being taken into custody. The camera panned down to show the live exterior of the front porch. The senior bank executive, who had just tried to sneak out the front doors to escape the chaos, was surrounded by stern men wearing dark windbreakers with thick yellow letters spelling FBI on the back. Harper watched the television in absolute horror as her powerful, untouchable lover was forcefully shoved against the brick pillar, his hands violently yanked behind his back and locked into heavy steel handcuffs on live national television. The shock of the television broadcast froze the entire room, but the local police chief did not give anyone time to process the chaos. He turned his imposing figure toward Gary and Brenda, who were clutching each other in sheer terror near the grand fireplace. The chief pulled a heavy set of keys from his belt and firmly ordered them to vacate the property immediately. Gary tried to puff out his chest one last time, demanding to call his lawyers, but Mr. Kaplan simply reminded him that his legal representation required a retainer he could no longer afford. Brenda burst into hysterical sobs as two uniformed officers stepped forward, pointing directly toward the front doors. Outside, a sudden torrential downpour had begun to pound against the manicured lawns, mirroring the absolute destruction of their false empire. The officers forced Gary and Brenda to grab whatever suitcases Harper had packed earlier and marched them toward the exit. The remaining elite guests parted like the Red Sea, completely ignoring Brenda's desperate pleas for a ride or a place to stay. They watched in silent judgment as the arrogant couple was pushed out into the freezing rain. Gary struggled to pull two heavy leather suitcases across the wet pavement, his expensive Italian shoes slipping in the mud. Brenda's designer cashmere sweater was instantly soaked, clinging to her shivering frame as she stumbled down the driveway. They were completely stripped of their dignity, cast out into the dark storm with absolutely nowhere to go and not a single dime to their names. Inside the grand foyer, Harper was trembling violently, staring at the television screen where her lover was being shoved into a federal vehicle. She turned back to the police chief, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears of genuine panic. She clasped her hands together, begging the officers to understand that she was just a desperate mother trying to secure a future for her son. She tried to blame everything on Devin, claiming he forced her into the financial schemes. The police chief remained entirely unmoved by her theatrical performance. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a sharply folded legal document. Harper Wright, the chief, announced, his voice booming over the sound of the rain outside. "I hold here a warrant for your immediate arrest on multiple felony charges, including federal bank fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and forgery." Harper gasped, shaking her head frantically, denying the accusations. But the chief was not finished. He took a step closer, towering over her trembling frame. Furthermore, he continued sternly, "You are being charged with perjury and filing a false police report regarding the fabricated assault by your father-in-law, Edison Wright. We have the complete, unedited, hidden camera footage of you striking yourself with a brass candlestick." The color completely drained from Harper's face. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees right there on the pristine marble floor. The realization that Edison had been silently recording her malicious plot shattered her completely. Two female officers stepped forward, grabbing her firmly by the arms and hauling her back to her feet. Harper thrashed and screamed, pleading for someone to call her parents, begging for mercy from a room full of people who had already turned their backs on her. The officers swiftly pulled her arms behind her back, and the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the grand foyer. They read her the Miranda rights in a cold, mechanical tone as they marched her toward the heavy front doors. The glamorous socialite who had hosted a liberation party just an hour ago was now being paraded out of the estate as a common criminal, her expensive designer dress dragging across the muddy, wet pavement. Standing just beyond the perimeter of the flashing red and blue police lights, Devin watched the entire collapse of his world from the cold shadows of the street. He had driven his rusted utility truck back to the neighborhood, unable to stay away, drawn back to the epicenter of his colossal failure. The torrential rain battered against his ruined suit, soaking him to the bone, but he could not bring himself to move. He stood completely frozen behind a thick oak tree, witnessing the brutal poetic justice unfolding on his front lawn. First he saw Gary and Brenda dragging their heavy luggage through the mud, slipping and cursing as the pouring rain destroyed their expensive clothes. The same people who had mocked his skin color and thrown him out like garbage were now homeless, wandering the dark suburban streets with absolutely nothing. A deep, bitter sense of vindication flared in Devin's chest, but it was quickly swallowed by a wave of profound emptiness. Then the heavy front doors swung open again. Devin held his breath as two uniformed officers marched his wife out onto the porch. Harper was screaming hysterically, her hands securely cuffed behind her back, her glamorous party dress completely soaked by the storm. Devin watched helplessly as she kicked and fought against the officers, begging for a lawyer she could no longer afford. For years, he had alienated his own father to protect this woman, to fund her lavish lifestyle and secure his place in her elite world. He had turned a blind eye to her cruelty, allowed her to banish Edison to a damp basement, and forged his father's name just to keep a smile on her face. Now, seeing her true malicious nature fully exposed and punished, Devin realized he had sacrificed his soul for an absolute illusion. He watched as the officers forcefully shoved Harper into the back of a wet police cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping her inside. The flashing sirens illuminated his pale, soaked face, highlighting the sheer magnitude of his regret. He had lost his father, his business, his home, and his family. He was entirely alone, standing in the freezing rain with nothing but the crushing weight of his own profound cowardice. Devin took a shaky step backward, preparing to turn around and walk back to the cold cabin of his rusted utility truck. He believed the nightmare had finally reached its peak, and that he was nothing more than a ruined spectator to his wife's destruction. But as he turned his heel on the wet pavement, a bright, blinding flashlight suddenly snapped on, hitting him directly in the face. Two stern men wearing dark rain jackets stepped out from the shadows, blocking his only path of escape. Devin shielded his eyes, squinting against the harsh glare. Devin Wright, the taller man, asked, his voice cutting sharply through the sound of the pouring rain. Devin swallowed hard, giving a slow, defeated nod, expecting them to tell him to clear the area. Instead, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest for gross corporate negligence and severe financial embezzlement," the agent stated coldly, grabbing Devin's soaking wet shoulder. You are coming with us. Devon sat on the rigid steel bench of the county holding cell, pulling his thin orange jumpsuit tightly across his chest. The fabric offered absolutely no protection against the freezing air conditioning that blasted through the sterile concrete room. His designer suit, the last pathetic symbol of his fake wealth, had been stripped away and bagged in the evidence room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, casting long, bleak shadows against the cinder-block walls. There were no windows, no clocks, and no sense of time passing. It felt like he had been locked in this freezing concrete box for an eternity, left entirely alone with the deafening echoes of his own colossal failures. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashing police lights and the furious rain washing away the grand illusion he had spent years meticulously building. He thought about Harper being dragged away in handcuffs, screaming for a lawyer she could not afford. He thought about Gary and Brenda stumbling through the mud, stripped of the very estate they had proudly stolen. But mostly he thought about the heavy steel cuffs biting into his own wrists when the federal agents arrested him on the dark street. His tech startup was a massive fraud. His entire marriage was a calculated transaction. He had literally gambled away his soul. Devon pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs as a violent shiver wrecked his body. He was completely broken. The staggering weight of federal embezzlement charges hung over his head, promising decades behind bars. He had absolutely no friends to call, no secret accounts to tap into, and no high-powered attorneys ready to rush to his defense. He was a ruined, destitute man, sitting in a freezing cell waiting for the final blow to land. The heavy steel door of the visitation room clanked loudly, sliding open with a harsh metallic screech. Devon slowly raised his head, his bloodshot eyes adjusting to the bright hallway light. A tall, imposing figure walked into the sterile room. It was not a court-appointed public defender. It was his father. Edison Wright wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating the kind of absolute, unshakable power that money alone could never buy. He sat down on the metal chair across the scratched steel table, looking at his son with a calm, terrifyingly unreadable expression. Devon swallowed hard, feeling a pathetic surge of hope rising in his chest. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking dryly in his throat. "You came. You actually came." Edison did not smile. He did not reach across the table to offer a comforting hand. "I did not come here to rescue you, Devon," he stated, his voice carrying a cold, clinical precision. "I came here to look you in the eye and see if there is anything left of the boy I raised." Devon flinched as if he had been physically struck. "Dad, please, I know I messed up," he pleaded, tears welling in his sunken eyes. "Harper manipulated everything. She lied to me about the bank, about her parents, about everything. I was just trying to keep my business afloat. I was trying to make you proud." Edison slammed his large, calloused hand flat against the steel table, causing the metal to vibrate loudly. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the victim," he commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "You did not forge my signature out of blind loyalty to your wife. You did it out of sheer, unparalleled greed. You allowed those racist parasites to mock your heritage and treat your father like a stray dog because you were too weak to stand on your own 2 feet. You wanted the luxury cars and the country club parties so desperately that you sold your own flesh and blood to finance the illusion. You threw away $500,000 of my hard-earned money at blackjack tables while smiling in my face." Devon shrank back against the concrete wall, the devastating truth stripping away his final remaining layer of defense. "You wanted to be a tech titan, but you are nothing more than a pathetic coward who let a fraudulent woman convince him to lock his own father in a basement." Edison continued relentlessly. "You traded your integrity for a lifestyle you could not afford, and now the bill has finally come due." The brutal, undeniable reality of his father's words shattered the very last remnants of Devon's ego. The arrogant tech executive, the man who believed he was inherently better than the working-class neighborhood he came from, completely ceased to exist. Devon lowered his head, burying his face in his trembling hands as deep, agonizing sobs wrecked his chest. He was not crying because he had been caught. He was crying because he finally saw himself exactly as his father saw him, a weak, foolish man who had actively participated in his own destruction. "Dad, you are right," he sobbed, his voice muffled by his hands. "You are entirely right. I am a coward. I am a complete failure. I deserve to be locked in this cell. I deserve every single thing the federal prosecutors are going to do to me." He wiped his face with the rough sleeve of his orange jumpsuit, taking a shaky, desperate breath. He looked up at Edison, his eyes red and swollen, stripped of any manipulation or deceit. I am not asking you for bail money, he said, his voice dropping to a raw, desperate whisper. I am not asking you to hire Mr. Kaplan to fight my embezzlement charges. I will plead guilty. I will serve my time and pay for what I did to you. But there is one thing I am begging you to do. One single thing. Devin leaned forward, pressing his chest against the cold steel table. Harper is facing a decade in federal prison for bank fraud and forgery. I am going away for corporate negligence. Gary and Brenda are entirely bankrupt and facing their own accessory charges. My son has absolutely nobody left. If you do not step in right now, the state is going to place little Mason into the foster care system by the end of the day. A fresh wave of tears cascaded down Devin's face. He is 7 years old, Dad. He has nothing to do with this mess. He is innocent. Please do not let my son pay the price for my colossal failures. Let him live in the house. Take custody of him. Raise him the way you raised me before I ruined everything. Raise him to be a better man than his father. I am begging you on my knees. Please save my boy from the orphanage. Edison sat completely motionless, listening to the desperate, agonizing plea of his broken son. The sterile holding room was filled only with the sound of Devin's ragged breathing and the harsh buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. For the very first time since the devastating confrontation at the birthday party, Devin was not asking for a magical financial rescue for himself. He was finally acting like a father, placing the survival of his own innocent child above his personal freedom. Edison looked at the tears streaming down Devin's face, observing the total surrender of a man who had finally hit absolute rock bottom. Slowly and deliberately, Edison placed his hands on the steel table and pushed his chair back. The metal legs scraped loudly against the concrete floor. He stood up, towering over the small, defeated figure of his son. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket and looked down at Devin with a profoundly unreadable expression. He did not nod. He did not offer a single word of comfort or confirm that he would intervene with the State Child Protective Services. Edison simply turned his back on his weeping son and walked straight toward the heavy steel door. He knocked twice, signaling the guard outside. The door clicked open, and Edison stepped out into the bright hallway, letting the heavy metal slam shut behind him. He left Devin sitting entirely alone in the freezing cell, swallowed by a crushing, hopeless silence. 2 weeks after my silent departure from the county jail, the heavy mahogany doors of the family court swung open. The air inside the courtroom was thick with a suffocating tension. This was not a trial for money or stolen real estate. This was a battle for the most valuable legacy of all, the life of my 7-year-old grandson Mason. With Devin facing federal embezzlement charges and Harper sitting in a state penitentiary awaiting trial for massive bank fraud, the state had to determine the permanent guardianship of their child. I sat at the polished petitioner's table with Mr. Kaplan, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded calmly over the mahogany surface. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, radiating the quiet, unshakable authority that had terrified my enemies at the restaurant. Across the center aisle, sitting at the respondents' table, were Gary and Brenda. The past 14 days had been incredibly cruel to them. Stripped of their stolen wealth and evicted from my estate, they looked like hollow shadows of their former arrogant selves. Gary wore a wrinkled, ill-fitting suit that smelled faintly of cheap motel soap. Brenda's hair was unkempt, and she lacked the expensive jewelry she used to proudly flaunt. They had managed to scrape together enough borrowed cash to hire a sleazy, desperate family lawyer who looked like he had not slept in days. They were completely bankrupt, but their sheer entitlement refused to die. They were here to fight me for Mason, convinced that they still held some imaginary superior status over me. The Honorable Judge Caldwell, a stern woman with decades of experience presiding over bitter family disputes, entered the room and took her seat at the high bench. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the two warring sides. The custody hearing was officially in session, and the stakes could not possibly have been higher. Gary's sleazy lawyer stood up first, launching immediately into a desperate and deeply offensive argument. He paced back and forth, attempting to paint a picture of Gary and Brenda as loving, stable grandparents who had been unfairly victimized by a sudden financial misunderstanding. But the core of his argument quickly shifted to a vicious character assassination aimed directly at me. The lawyer claimed that Mason, a boy accustomed to a specific affluent lifestyle, needed to be raised by his maternal bloodline to preserve his cultural environment. He argued that I was an elderly, detached man who had spent his life working on dirty construction sites, completely unequipped to nurture a child of Mason's pedigree. Brenda pulled out a wrinkled tissue, dabbing her dry eyes, crying fake tears for the judge. But Gary could not contain his bitter hatred. His fragile ego, shattered by his absolute financial ruin, took complete control. He ignored his lawyer's attempts to restrain him and stood up, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Your Honor, you cannot give my grandson to this man!" Gary shouted, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "He is a thug hiding behind a fancy suit. He spent the last year living in a dark, damp basement because that is exactly where his kind belongs. Mason has white blood in his veins. He belongs with his own people, not with some street hustler who uses dirty money to ruin respectable families. Putting a boy like Mason in the hands of a black man who knows nothing about our society will completely destroy his future. He belongs with us." The entire courtroom fell into a shocked, dead silence. The court reporters stopped typing. The bailiffs stood up straighter, resting their hands on their utility belts. The sheer blatant racism spewing from Gary's mouth was vile and unfiltered. He was a ruined, desperate man wielding the only weapon he thought he had left: his toxic prejudice. He genuinely believed that his skin color automatically made him a better guardian than a self-made millionaire of color. Judge Caldwell slammed her heavy wooden gavel loudly against the sounding block, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She sternly warned Gary that one more outburst of such disgusting, bigoted language would result in an immediate contempt of court charge. I did not flinch. I did not yell back or show a single ounce of anger. I just looked at Gary with absolute pity, knowing he had just handed me the shovel to bury him. Mr. Kaplan stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with meticulous precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The truth he held in his hands was a weapon of mass destruction. "Your Honor," Mr. Kaplan began, his voice echoing with cold authority. "The respondents have made some very bold claims about providing a stable, culturally appropriate environment for this child. Let us examine the actual reality of that environment." Mr. Kaplan approached the bench and handed a thick, heavily documented folder directly to the judge. "First, Your Honor, let us address their financial stability. Gary and Brenda currently reside in a weekly rental motel. All of their assets, bank accounts, and properties have been completely seized by federal marshals due to their active complicity in a multi-million-dollar bank fraud conspiracy. They cannot even provide a permanent roof over their own heads, let alone a child. But poverty is not their greatest sin." Mr. Kaplan pulled a second folder from his briefcase, this one sealed with a red confidential stamp. He handed a copy to the judge and tossed another copy directly onto Gary's table. Gary looked down at the paperwork, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. His jaw went slack. "These are sealed police records and Child Protective Service reports from 25 years ago," Mr. Kaplan stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "These documents prove that Gary has an extensive documented history of severe domestic violence and child endangerment. When Harper was a young girl, Gary was arrested twice for physical abuse. He broke his own daughter's arm during a drunken rage, and Brenda stood by and covered it up. They fostered a toxic, violent household that created the very criminal behavior their daughter is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary for." Mr. Kaplan turned to face Gary, staring him down with absolute disgust. "The violent, racist outburst we all just witnessed in this courtroom is not a momentary lapse in judgment. It is the core of who this man is. He is an abusive, unstable predator who views his own grandson not as a child to be loved, but as a final pawn to exploit for government assistance." I remained seated, watching the absolute devastation wash over Gary and Brenda. They had tried to use my race and my age to disqualify me completely, forgetting that their own monstrous past was documented and waiting in the shadows. They had no love to give Mason. They only wanted to use him as a meal ticket to escape the gutter they had built for themselves. Judge Caldwell flipped through the horrific abuse records, her face hardening into a mask of pure disgust. She closed the folder sharply and looked down at Gary and Brenda with absolute contempt. "The fact that you would dare step into my courtroom spewing bigoted hatred while hiding a history of child abuse is beyond repulsive," Judge Caldwell announced, her voice ringing like thunder. "You are not only financially destitute, you are morally and psychologically bankrupt. You pose a severe, immediate danger to the physical and emotional well-being of this child." She picked up her heavy wooden gavel, her eyes locking onto mine with a look of profound respect. "Therefore, the court completely strips Gary and Brenda of any and all visitation or guardianship rights regarding the minor child Mason Wright. Furthermore, I am granting sole physical and legal custody to the paternal grandfather Edison Wright, effective immediately." The gavel slammed down with a resounding crack echoing finality through the massive room. Gary let out a furious, animalistic scream, lunging across the table toward me. But he did not even make it 2 steps before 3 armed bailiffs tackled him to the floor, pinning his arms aggressively behind his back. Brenda wailed hysterically as the officers dragged her violent husband out of the courtroom. I stood up calmly, buttoning my suit jacket. The war for my bloodline was officially over. Mason was finally safe. 2 days after the explosive custody hearing that stripped Gary and Brenda of any rights to my grandson, I found myself walking back into the sterile, freezing corridors of the county detention center. The heavy steel doors clanged shut behind me and my attorney, Mr. Kaplan, as we were escorted into a private, windowless consultation room. A guard led Devin into the room moments later. My son looked completely hollowed out. His orange jumpsuit hung loosely over his shrinking frame, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights. He sat down across from us, staring at the scratched metal table, his hands shackled to his waist chain. He did not look like a man expecting salvation. He looked like a man waiting for his execution. Mr. Kaplan did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal briefs, dropping them loudly onto the table. Devin flinched at the sound. Mr. Kaplan leaned forward, adjusting his glasses with a sharp, clinical precision. He announced that his forensic accounting team had spent the last 48 hours relentlessly tearing apart the financial records of the fraudulent home equity line of credit. They had uncovered a monumental breakthrough. The digital footprints, communications, and bank security logs proved undeniably that Harper had acted completely independently when forging my signature and orchestrating the massive loan. She had actively hidden the deepest layers of the fraud from Devin, using her illicit affair with the bank executive to bypass the standard security protocols. Mr. Kaplan explained that while Devin was guilty of gross corporate negligence and profound financial incompetence, he was not the mastermind of the federal conspiracy. Armed with this undeniable proof, Mr. Kaplan had negotiated directly with the federal prosecutors. They were willing to drop the heavy felony embezzlement and bank fraud charges against Devin entirely. He would only have to plead guilty to minor misdemeanor charges regarding his business mismanagement, which carried absolute 0 jail time. He was being offered a complete miraculous acquittal from federal prison. A ragged, gasping breath escaped Devin's throat. His trembling hands gripped the edge of the cold steel table as the sheer magnitude of Mr. Kaplan's words washed over him. He looked up at me, tears of profound relief pooling in his bloodshot eyes. He whispered a desperate thank you, his voice cracking with emotion, believing that I had simply arrived to rescue him, to wipe the slate clean and restore his life just as I had done so many times before. He thought the nightmare was finally over. But I did not smile back. My expression remained carved from solid stone. I raised my hand, silencing his pathetic gratitude instantly. I told him in a voice devoid of any paternal warmth that this legal rescue was not a gift. It was a strict, calculated transaction. I nodded to Mr. Kaplan, who smoothly pulled a second document from his briefcase. It was not a court filing or a plea deal. It was a thick, tightly bound contract stamped with a heavy red legal seal. Mr. Kaplan slid the document across the metal table, stopping it right in front of Devin's chained hands. "This is an irrevocable waiver of inheritance," Mr. Kaplan stated, his tone shifting from a defender to an absolute executioner. "By signing this document, you, Devin Wright, are permanently, legally, and entirely forfeiting your right to inherit a single dime of your father's multi-million-dollar estate. You will have no claim to his commercial properties, his liquid assets, his holding companies, or his personal wealth. Not today, not tomorrow, and not upon his death. You are walking away with absolutely nothing." Devin stared at the thick white paper, his mind struggling to process the devastating condition. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, making sure he felt the crushing weight of my gaze. "For 40 years I built an empire so you would never have to know the sting of poverty," I told him, my voice dangerously quiet. "I handed you $500,000 and you squandered it on blackjack tables and luxury cars to impress a racist family that despised you. You allowed money to mutate you into a coward. You let greed blind you so completely that you stood by while your wife tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward. If you want your freedom today, you must surrender the very thing that poisoned your soul. You will never be a millionaire, Devin. You will never touch my wealth again. You will leave this jail with nothing but the clothes on your back and the crushing reality of your own actions. Devin looked down at the contract, his chest heaving as the ultimate consequence of his failures materialized in black and white. He licked his dry lips and asked in a broken whisper what was going to happen to the estate. Mr. Kaplan did not hesitate to deliver the final crushing reality of the arrangement. Every single commercial property, every piece of undeveloped land, every hidden investment portfolio, and every dollar in those offshore accounts is being transferred immediately into an ironclad blind trust, Mr. Kaplan explained, tapping a manicured finger against the paperwork. The sole exclusive beneficiary of this multi-million-dollar empire is your son, Mason. But there are extremely strict stipulations. Mason will not receive a single penny when he turns 18. The trust will remain completely locked until his 25th birthday. Furthermore, the release of these funds is entirely contingent upon him meeting rigorous educational and ethical requirements overseen perpetually by my law firm. Devin blinked furiously, trying to absorb the sheer scale of the legal fortress being built around his child. Mr. Kaplan leaned in closer, ensuring there was no room for any lingering delusions. And let me be absolutely clear, Devin, you will have zero access to this trust. You cannot manage it, you cannot borrow against it. You cannot use it as collateral, and you cannot even request a modest monthly stipend from it for your living expenses. You are legally barred from ever touching your son's inheritance. If you attempt to manipulate him for financial gain, the trust will be immediately redirected to a series of designated charities. I looked deeply into my son's eyes, driving the final nail into the coffin of his arrogant past. I am protecting my grandson from the exact same corruption that utterly destroyed you, I said, my voice echoing sharply in the small concrete room. I am breaking the cycle of entitlement right here and right now. You wanted to be a father, Devin. Now you will have to prove you can be one without relying on a golden parachute. You will have to build your own life entirely from scratch, just like I did. You will sweat, you will struggle, and you will finally learn the true value of a hard-earned dollar. The terms are absolute and they are non-negotiable. You sign the paper, and you walk out of here a free man. You refuse, and Mr. Kaplan packs up his briefcase right now, leaving you to face the federal prosecutors entirely on your own. The harsh buzzing of the fluorescent lights filled the heavy silence of the interrogation room. I watched Devin's face intently, waiting for the inevitable pushback. I expected the old Devin to surface the arrogant, entitled tech executive who would argue, negotiate, or throw a childish tantrum about what he was rightfully owed. I expected him to scream that it was unfair to cut him out of the family fortune completely. Instead, Devin looked at the heavy black pen resting on top of the contract. The arrogance that had defined his entire adult life was completely and utterly eradicated. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I did not see a spoiled manipulator looking back. I saw a man who finally understood the sheer gravity of his sins. Tears began to stream silently down his sunken cheeks, dropping onto the collar of his orange jumpsuit. He realized that this brutal, devastating contract was actually the ultimate act of love. I was saving him from a federal prison sentence, but more importantly, I was saving his soul through absolute deprivation. Devin did not utter a single word of complaint. He did not ask for a fraction of a percentage or beg for a small living allowance to get him back on his feet. He reached out with trembling, shackled hands and picked up the heavy black pen. Without a single moment of hesitation, he pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name on the dotted line, legally severing himself from the empire he had coveted so badly. He pushed the signed contract back across the steel table, his head bowed in total surrender. A heavy metallic clank echoed through the room as the guard unlocked the door, signaling the end of the meeting. Devin was finally a free man, but he was stepping out into the world completely and utterly penniless. Devin stepped through the heavy glass doors of the county detention center, and the harsh afternoon sun instantly blinded him. He stood on the concrete steps wearing the exact same clothes he had on the night of his arrest. His expensive Italian suit was now a wrinkled, filthy rag smelling of stale sweat and county jail disinfectant. He took a deep breath of free air, but the sheer reality of his total bankruptcy immediately suffocated him. He had no wallet, no credit cards, no phone, and absolutely nowhere to go. At the bottom of the concrete steps, my sleek black town car idled quietly. The tinted rear window rolled down, revealing my impassive face. Devin practically ran down the stairs, a pathetic wave of relief washing over him. He reached for the polished door handle, fully expecting to slide into the luxurious leather interior and be driven back to a comfortable guest room in my penthouse. He thought I would at least give him a soft place to land. I locked the door from the inside. The heavy click stopped him dead in his tracks. I rolled the window down just enough to pass a small duffel bag through the gap. Devin caught it looking at me with pure confusion. Inside that bag you will find 2 sets of heavy denim work clothes, steel-toed boots, a hard hat, and a prepaid burner phone. I told him, my voice offering absolutely no comfort. There is also exactly $100 in cash to get you a bed at the halfway house downtown and a hot meal tonight. Devin gripped the rough canvas bag, his eyes wide with panic. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "I have absolutely nothing. You cannot leave me on the street. I cannot stay at a halfway house. Let me sleep on your couch just for a few nights until I figure things out." I looked at him with cold, unwavering resolve. "You figured things out when you signed that contract," I replied. "You are a free man, Devin, but freedom is not free. You are going to earn your keep. Be at the address text message to that burner phone at exactly 5 in the morning tomorrow. Do not be late." I rolled the window up, cutting off his desperate pleas, and signaled my driver to pull away, leaving him standing completely alone on the sidewalk, clutching a bag of cheap work clothes. The address on the burner phone led Devin to a massive commercial development zone on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was one of the largest ongoing projects funded entirely by my silent holding companies. When Devin arrived at 5 in the morning, the sky was still pitch black and the air was freezing. The site foreman, a tough, unforgiving man who had worked for me for 2 decades, tossed a heavy pair of leather work gloves at Devin's chest. There was no special treatment. There was no nepotism. Devin was assigned to the demolition and debris removal crew, the absolute lowest and most grueling tier of manual labor on the entire site. For a man who had spent his entire adult life sitting in ergonomic chairs inside air-conditioned glass offices, the physical shock was absolutely devastating. His first task was hauling broken slabs of concrete and twisted rebar from a demolished foundation into heavy metal dumpsters. By noon, the relentless sun was beating down on his back, baking the dust and sweat into his skin. His hands, soft from years of typing emails and holding champagne glasses, blistered and bled within the first 4 hours. Every single muscle in his back and shoulders screamed in agonizing pain. He struggled to lift the heavy sledgehammer, his arms shaking so violently he could barely strike the concrete. The other laborers, men who worked tirelessly to feed their families, pushed past him effortlessly, carrying twice the load without breaking a sweat. Nobody cared about his former title as a tech chief executive. Nobody cared about his ruined Italian suits. Out here on the dirt and gravel, a man's worth was measured entirely by the strength of his back and his willingness to endure. As Devin dragged a heavy wheelbarrow full of jagged rocks across the uneven terrain, his lungs burning with inhaled dust, a profound realization finally crashed down upon him. This was exactly how I had built my empire. For 40 years, I had broken my own body, inhaling toxic dust and tearing my muscles so that he could grow up in a pristine suburban home. I had shielded him from the brutal reality of hard labor, and he had repaid me by treating me like a worthless servant. The physical agony radiating through Devin's body brought an incredibly harsh mental clarity. Every swing of the hammer, every heavy lift felt like a direct punishment for his arrogance. He was finally feeling the exact weight of the money he had so carelessly gambled away at the casino. 3 grueling weeks passed, and Devin was rapidly approaching his absolute breaking point. His body was battered, bruised, and constantly aching. He spent his nights sleeping on a thin, lumpy mattress in a crowded halfway house surrounded by men fighting their own demons. He ate cheap canned soup and soaked his bleeding, calloused hands in cold water just to numb the throbbing pain. The former millionaire who used to complain if his expensive steak was slightly overcooked was now desperately grateful for a lukewarm shower and a quiet place to close his eyes. But the mental toll was becoming infinitely heavier than the physical strain. He was completely isolated. He had not heard a single word from Harper, who was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, and he had no idea how his son Mason was doing. The crushing loneliness was eating him alive. It was a sweltering Friday afternoon, and the heat index on the construction site had reached brutal heights. Devin was tasked with breaking down a massive reinforced concrete wall. The heavy sledgehammer felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Dust coated his throat, making him cough violently. He swung the hammer, hitting the concrete with a dull thud, sending painful shockwaves straight up his arms. The hammer slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering loudly onto the gravel. Devin fell to his knees, his chest heaving, his lungs desperate for clean air. He looked at his ruined, bleeding hands and felt the last remaining shred of his willpower completely snap. He could not do this anymore. The pain was too immense. He decided right then and there to quit. He was going to walk over to the foreman, hand in his yellow hard hat, and just disappear into the city. He would rather be homeless than endure another second of this torturous labor. He slowly pushed himself up from the dirt, wiping the gritty sweat from his eyes, preparing to surrender completely. As he turned his head toward the foreman's trailer, a glint of sunlight catching on black paint made him freeze. Parked directly across the dusty street, safely behind the chain-link perimeter fence, was my sleek black town car. The rear door opened and I stepped out onto the sidewalk. I was not alone. I reached back into the car and gently guided a small figure out onto the pavement. It was Mason. My 7-year-old grandson stood safely behind the tall chain-link fence, wearing a bright yellow shirt and holding my hand tightly. Mason looked through the metal diamond grid, his wide, innocent eyes scanning the loud, chaotic construction site. He did not look frightened or ashamed. He looked completely mesmerized by the massive cranes, the heavy machinery, and the men working tirelessly in the dirt. Then Mason's eyes locked directly onto Devin. Devin stood frozen in the center of the rubble, his face coated in gray dust, his clothes soaked in sweat, holding nothing but his own crushing defeat. He had not seen his son since the day the police dragged him out of the mansion. He expected Mason to look away in disgust to see a broken failure of a father. Instead, Mason pointed a small finger at him, looking up at me with a bright, proud smile, as if he were watching a superhero rebuilding the world. I looked across the street, meeting Devin's exhausted, bloodshot eyes. I did not wave. I did not smile. I simply offered a silent, heavy challenge. I was showing him exactly who was watching his next move. Will you quit in front of your own blood? Devin stared at the little boy and then looked down at his ruined, bleeding hands. The agonizing pain in his muscles suddenly vanished. He turned his back on the foreman's trailer, bent down into the dirt, and picked up the heavy sledgehammer, gripping the wooden handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. He planted his boots firmly in the gravel, locked his eyes onto the concrete wall, and swung the hammer with everything he had left. The heavy sledgehammer striking the concrete was not just the sound of my son rebuilding his shattered character. It was the steady rhythm of absolute justice finalizing its course. In the weeks that followed, the brutal reality of the legal system crashed down heavily upon the architects of my attempted destruction. Harper stood trembling in a federal courtroom, entirely stripped of her designer gowns, her expensive makeup, and her arrogant smirk. The presiding judge showed absolutely zero leniency for her coordinated bank fraud forgery and the malicious false police report she had confidently filed against me. She wept bitterly, wiping her face with shackled hands as the gavel fell, sentencing her to 5 hard years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Her powerful bank executive lover had quickly taken a plea deal, leaving her to absorb the devastating brunt of the federal charges entirely alone. Meanwhile, Gary and Brenda finally discovered the true, agonizing meaning of the poverty they had so casually mocked. With all their assets seized by federal marshals to pay back the bank and Gary's violent history exposed to the public, they became instant pariahs. They were brutally evicted and forced to rent a decaying, roach-infested apartment in the absolute worst industrial district of the city. The wealthy country club friends they used to entertain immediately blocked their phone numbers. I received a brief final report from Mr. Kaplan detailing how Gary now worked the graveyard shift, sweeping floors at a rundown gas station just to afford basic groceries, while Brenda spent her days staring blankly at peeling wallpaper, a bitter, silent ghost of her former arrogant self. They were permanently trapped in a miserable concrete cage built entirely by their own prejudice and blinding greed. With the toxic parasites permanently removed from the property, I focused entirely on reclaiming the $2 million estate and transforming it into a genuine sanctuary for my grandson. The house Harper had meticulously decorated was sterile cold and utterly devoid of any real soul. It was a flashy museum meant to impress wealthy strangers, not a warm home meant to nurture a growing child. I hired a crew of my most trusted construction contractors to systematically rip out the pretentious modern art, the useless marble pedestals, and the highly uncomfortable designer furniture. I took the massive grand living room, the exact place where Harper had brazenly thrown her lavish liberation party, and completely repurposed it. We installed floor-to-ceiling solid mahogany bookshelves along every single wall. I filled those sturdy shelves with thousands of physical books, ranging from classic literature and historical biographies to thick, complex volumes on engineering, architecture, and mathematics. I wanted Mason to be surrounded by immense knowledge rather than empty luxury. In the center of the room, I placed a massive, heavy oak table where we could sit together in the quiet evenings and read. I brought up my old drafted blueprints from my early career and framed them on the walls, showing Mason exactly how I had designed and built the commercial structures that funded his entire future. The cold, echoing mansion was finally filled with the warm, comforting scent of old paper, rich wood, and genuine peace. The dark, damp basement where they had tried to bury me and silence my existence was completely renovated into a state-of-the-art media and playroom for Mason, ensuring that no corner of the estate held any lingering darkness. I was purposefully erasing every single trace of their arrogance and replacing it with a foundation of substance and absolute security. Mason thrived in this newly restored environment. Without the constant screaming, the toxic arguments, and the superficial demands of his parents, he became a calm, curious, and incredibly bright young boy. He was no longer a prop used for country club photo opportunities. He was my bloodline, and I was going to ensure his mind was fortified against the very illusions of wealth that had utterly destroyed his father. But surrounding Mason with books was only half of the education I intended to provide. I knew intimately that wealth without the grounding anchor of hard physical labor inevitably breeds profound entitlement. I refused to let my grandson grow up believing that money simply materialized from a magic plastic card or a trust fund. I took him out to the sprawling, manicured backyard and promptly fired the expensive landscaping crew Harper had retained for years. I bought a set of child-sized gardening tools and several heavy bags of nutrient-rich topsoil. Together, under the bright, warm afternoon sun, we dug deep into the earth. I taught a 7-year-old boy how to properly plant a row of sturdy oak saplings, showing him how to carefully pack the dirt around the fragile roots and water them just enough to encourage deep, permanent growth. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and told him that nothing strong ever grows overnight. Real strength requires patience, dirty hands, and consistent daily care. Mason listened with wide, fascinated eyes, his small hands coated in dark mud, entirely and completely happy. We did not stop at the garden. I opened up the massive 3-car garage and converted one entire bay into a fully functional workshop. When Mason's expensive imported bicycle broke a chain, I did not simply order a brand new one online like his mother would have done. I handed him a grease-stained rag and a heavy metal wrench. We sat on the hard concrete floor for 2 solid hours, taking the gears apart and putting them back together. I guided his small hands, teaching him how the mechanical links functioned, how to apply the grease, and how to correctly test the tension. When he finally rode that repaired bike down the long driveway, his face beamed with a kind of genuine radiant pride that no store-bought toy could ever produce. He was learning the absolute dignity of self-reliance. He was learning that broken things can be fixed if you are willing to put in the actual work. I was pouring 40 years of accumulated wisdom into his young mind, replacing the superficial, fragile values of his past with the unbreakable concrete values of a builder. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks seamlessly blended into months. A beautiful, quiet rhythm settled over the grand estate. The chaotic nightmare of police raids, forged bank documents, and bitter courtroom battles slowly faded into a distant, manageable memory. I watched Mason grow taller, stronger, and infinitely wiser than his years. He excelled in his classes, read voraciously in our grand library, and spent his weekends happily covered in grease and dirt in my garage workshop. He was becoming exactly the kind of honorable, grounded young man I had always hoped to raise. I had successfully insulated him from the toxic wreckage of his parents' catastrophic choices. For 3 unbroken years, we lived in absolute, uninterrupted peace. The anonymous trust remained entirely secure. My real estate investments continued to multiply quietly, and the dark shadows of the past seemed permanently banished from our lives. I truly believed the brutal war was completely over, and that the final chapter of my life would simply be a quiet, rewarding sunset, watching my grandson flourish. But on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 years after I had rolled up my tinted car window and left my son standing alone on the sidewalk, the heavy brass knocker on the front oak doors echoed loudly through the silent house. I slowly walked across the pristine marble floor of the grand foyer, wondering who could possibly be interrupting our quiet afternoon. I pulled open the heavy oak doors, fully expecting to see a delivery driver or perhaps a local contractor. Instead, I froze completely speechless. Standing on the welcome mat was my son. But this was not the arrogant, pampered tech executive who used to sneer at me in his expensive Italian suits. The man standing before me had been entirely transformed by 3 years of grueling, relentless manual labor. Devin's skin was baked dark by the unforgiving sun, deeply tanned and weathered from thousands of hours working outside in the dirt and gravel. He wore a simple faded flannel shirt, heavy denim work jeans, and scuffed steel-toed boots that carried the unmistakable dust of a construction site. His shoulders were broad and muscular, no longer slumped with the weight of hidden casino debts and cowardly lies. But what struck me the most were his hands. They were rough, thick, and heavily calloused, permanently scarred by sledgehammers and rough concrete. He looked exactly like I did 40 years ago. He looked like a real builder. Devin did not confidently stride inside or demand my attention. He stood humbly on the porch, holding a simple white cardboard bakery box in his calloused hands. He looked me directly in the eyes, his gaze clear, steady, and entirely stripped of entitlement. "Dad," he said, his voice deep and calm. "I know I do not have the right to be here unannounced, but today is Mason's 10th birthday. I just finished a double shift at the site and I wanted to bring him this. I bought it with my own paycheck. It is not much, just a chocolate cake, but I earned every single dollar for it, honestly. I just wanted to leave it for him." I looked down at the simple cardboard box and then back up at the rough, scarred hands holding it. The profound silence between us carried the weight of everything we had survived. I did not say a word. I simply took a step back and pulled the heavy oak door wide open, offering him silent entry. Devin swallowed hard, carefully wiping his dusty boots on the mat before stepping over the threshold into the home he had once tried to steal. Moments later, Mason came running down the sweeping staircase, stopping dead in his tracks when he saw his father. There was no screaming, no dramatic apologies, and no toxic theatricality. Just a quiet, grounded reunion between a working man and his son. Watching them sit at the heavy oak table in our library, sharing a modest slice of cake bought with honest sweat, I finally felt a profound sense of absolute peace. The brutal war had been entirely worth it. I realized a harsh, undeniable truth about parenting. Sometimes you have to absolutely shatter the illusions of the people you love to save the humanity left inside them. If I had simply paid his debts and shielded him from the consequences of his greed, I would have doomed him to a lifetime of pathetic weakness. By stripping away every single dime of his unearned wealth and forcing him to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of hard labor, I did not destroy my son. I tore down a crumbling, fraudulent facade and forced him to build a man made of solid concrete. He was finally a father worthy of his child. My story of betrayal and redemption ends here, but the lessons we learned will last for generations to come. We rebuilt our family not on a foundation of stolen money and deceit, but on the unbreakable pillars of hard work, respect, and absolute honesty. Do you think I was too cruel to my son by completely stripping away his wealth and forcing him to work in the dirt? Or do you believe I did exactly what a real father must do to save his child from ultimate destruction? I would love to hear your honest opinion, so please share your thoughts and tell me what city you are listening from in the comments below. If you connected with this story of justice and tough love, you can support my channel by clicking the super thanks button right below the video. Your generous support allows me to keep producing and sharing these powerful life stories with you every single week. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that true wealth is never found in a bank account. Thank you for listening to my journey. I look forward to reading your comments, and I will see you in the next life story with love and respect. Another profound lesson this journey taught me is that entitlement is a slow poison. When you hand someone the world on a silver platter, you rob them of the resilience required to survive its inevitable storms. I realized that by previously financing Devin's every whim, I was not protecting him but completely crippling him. True wealth is not simply inherited, it is actively forged through struggle and honest sweat. When Devin finally learned to swing a heavy hammer, he did not just break concrete, he shattered the fragile, entitled shell that was suffocating his true potential. Human dignity can never be transferred. It must be earned day by grueling day. If you agree that the greatest inheritance a parent can leave is the unbreakable value of hard work, make sure to subscribe to the channel and share this video with your loved ones today.